開けるんだ開くのさその不思議な扉を登れるんだ登るのさ未来に触れるその心炸裂の富の節消えてゆく皆の命愛してる女性に裏切られ白涙が宇宙にさまよその行方さえも知らぬただただ自由に漂う登れるな登るのさ未来に触れるその心今私の遠いさ熱く燃える遠いさ水の証遠いさ敵を落とせ遠いさ我らの遠いさ
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by Sean Chapman.
And Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to peer into the delightfully deranged mind of Tomino Yoshiyuki with our Tomino-Thon. This week on the show, we bring you our action-packed climax for part 1 of our Tomino-Thon, where we will dive back into Pentagonal World. Last week, we of course covered the first half of Heavy Metal L-Gaim, episodes 1 to 26, and today we'll be discussing episodes 27 to 54. And man, what a show this is. We talked about last time that it felt like one of the least Tomino-flavored of the Tomino-Thon shows we had seen. And it ends up being one of the most, which was a transformation I was not expecting, but was very delighted to see. And I think it ends up kind of bucking the trend of this kind of weird trilogy of shows of Xabungle, Dunbine, and L-Gaim, where all three of these shows do go through, I think, a dramatic sort of metamorphosis in the second half. But for this one, not only is that metamorphosis really effectively done, but for me personally, I think the two halves of the show are very complementary to one another. And I think L-Gaim ends up being one of the best shows we've watched so far.
I couldn't agree more. I'm glad you agree. And totally, I think this is the only one of these three that gets affirmatively better. Its best stuff is in its second half, but not in a way that negates the first half. It's a really fun journey to go on, but absolutely. I think, and I know you liked the second half of Dunbine more than me, but we both agreed, obviously, it gets messier down the home stretch. Yes. It has more problems, and I think Xabungle has a lot more problems, and L-Gaim just kind of gets better and better as it goes along. And that second half, it's proto Zeta Gundam, basically. Yep. There's so much in the second half of L-Gaim where I'm just chomping at the bit to get to Zeta Gundam because it's reminding me of all the stuff I love in the next era of Gundam that's coming up. And yeah, I think for me personally, while Ideon is the best non-Gundam Tomino show we've watched, I think L-Gaim is the discovery of this season for me so far, because I knew Ideon was great. I just hadn't watched it yet. It gets talked about all the time. No one ever talks about Heavy Metal L-Gaim, in part because it's never been distributed here until this month with the Sentai Filmworks Blu-ray release. But it is a revelation. It is so much fun. It is so good. The animation in the second half of this show, too, also is Sunrise fully arriving as the Sunrise we know them to be. We are now in peak 1980s. This is one of the best anime studios on the planet, Sunrise, where we have gone from scrappy little upstart on Zambot 3, everything held together by duct tape and prayer, to they're doing full-on 3D shots years before there's the possibility of CGI, just through perspectival work in the animation, and it's full-on movie quality in places. It's wild. This show rocks.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that I'm with you. This is a kind of a revelation for me because, I had certain preconceived notions coming in because I played Super Robot Wars Y, and so I knew some the main plot twists in the last 5 or 6 episodes of the show were things that I knew happened. I knew about Posaydal's identity and Amandra Commander, like all those things, full flat, like that element, all of that is in that game, Super Robot Wars Y. Though there are a lot of like specific details for specific characters change because, you know, there's no hero from Gundam Wing and Godzilla and shit are not in the show, obviously. But a lot of those things were things I came in, so I kind of knew certain things of where, from a big picture perspective, the plot was going to go. But after watching the first half, which I thought was great, but I was getting a little bit tired of the kind of more meandering nature of the show and was ready for it to shift, and kind of was wanting it to move in a different direction. And it kind of does almost immediately after the part where we stopped. I do think like it just ends up transforming into a show that, as you said, is kind of becomes proto-Zeta Gundam, but also in a way that retains some of the kind of fantasy stylings of Dunbine. You know, this is still very much a space opera. It's not your kind of hardcore grounded sci-fi show like Zeta. It still has this kind of coding of sort of knights in shining armor, but we are in robots in space. And it keeps that flavor, and it ends up having, I think, just a very kind of special, unique identity unto itself, while serving as a really interesting bridge to where Tomino is going to go with Zeta Gundam onwards. And yeah, I just wasn't expecting it to be that. Like, I kind of was expecting it to continue more or less on the trend it had been based on the first half of the show. And then eventually, when you get very close to the end, I was expecting it. And then he's going to throw this big plot twist at us at the end. And instead, I think it's like so beautifully plotted. I think the characterization for all of the characters ends up blossoming. And I commented last time that it felt like one of the things that made it not feel like a super Tomino show was that the character psychology for most of the characters was fairly basic and fine. Like, if for a regular show, perfectly fine. But for Tomino, you kind of expect this very rich internal psychology for your characters, and basically every character ends up developing that. Even characters like Gable that were pretty one note and straightforward and very entertaining end up being hugely rich, I think, characters with like a really complex inner life, and that just persists through all the cast of characters. And so it really is this kind of butterfly of a show that, again, it's not to say the first half is bad. The first half is fantastic, and I think the first half builds to the second half beautifully. But it is this thing where it evolves and culminates in this really powerful way that I was very surprised by and very, very pleased by.
I mean, it basically starts exactly where we pick up today, because episode 27 is the one where you have Lessie go out. It's the first episode with the L-Gaim Mark II, but it's not an episode about Daba. It's very much about Lessie and Gavlet Gabele, and it's where she winds up like saving and sparing him, and it's where you get, I think, a real blossoming of the character psychology for both Lessie and Gabele, and you're like, oh, this is going in a new direction, and then it very much does go off in that new direction. And one of the benefits of that is that it also means that there's no, like, fatigue with this show. You don't get to the end of this and feel like you've watched 50 episodes of the same show. You kind of feel, it really does feel kind of like we talked about with Xabungle, like the season 1, season 2, like in the modern Gundam way, like Gundam 00 or Iron-Blooded Orphans, where we pick up kind of just feels like the start of season 2. And so episode 50 doesn't feel like episode 50. It kind of feels like episode 25 of its own thing, while still building on what season 1, quote-unquote, gave us. And obviously that's not how this was made or even intended, but it does play that way, and it means that this show is also, for a 54 fucking episode show, extremely well paced. You know, not perfectly. I don't think there's any perfectly paced 54 episode show. There are definitely some places where you go, okay, well, maybe this episode was a little bit of a cul-de-sac, but overall, like, just very little fatigue getting to the end of this thing, which, you know, we all know with these kind of, you know, 4-core year-round shows doesn't always happen.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's just no way to make, normally a 50 to 52, this ends up being a little bit longer, a 54 episode show. There's no way to do that and have it all be paced super perfectly and elegantly. But I do think there's a little bit of an almost miracle to me here with L-Gaim, because I am almost 100% certain that this was not the intended way for the show to happen. Like, right. I don't think that they sat down thinking, we'll have the first half of the show be very loose and episodic and kind of meandering, and have that, you know, in retrospect, very much reflect the attitudes of the main characters. Because I think one of the reasons why it feels like two complementary halves is that more meandering episodic first half mirrors Daba, who is also a character who, in an almost like, you know, slightly Hamlet-esque way, knows what he needs to do, but doesn't know how to do it, and is kind of hesitating to fully commit to what needs to happen here. And then the second half, for me, the really big cutoff point is episode 30, where Daba fully takes on the persona of Kamo Myroad. He accepts his role as like the Yarman Prince, who is the leader of the rebellion, and his role in the show very dramatically shifts at that point. And the whole tone and structure of the show becomes much more forward momentum aligned towards we are going to go deal with Posaydal come hell or high water. And they very quickly start assembling the Operation Stardust and all of that stuff around it. But we know from what we talked about the production notes last time that like this was not a show that was particularly like thoroughly planned out ahead of time. This was not a show that Tomino had sat down and had done his big crazy outlines and had built his whole kind of story Bible and all that kind of stuff. That then he would, eventually like throw out about half of that and come up with, actually, this is what I want new types to be, or actually, this is what I want Ito to be. Even when Tomino fully plans out his shows, he still, obviously these are living productions and he adjusts them along the way. But this was not that. This was him working with this younger staff, him giving the main writer of the show this like task of write this whole novel, and all this kind of stuff. And, it ends up being this thing where I think the production, I don't think Tomino really knew how to handle that in the first half, and it ended up being a really interesting show because all these really talented people are involved. And it had that quote from Watanabe Yuji, the writer, where he said it ended up being a show where it felt like all of our individual talents were on display, implying that like we weren't really working as a team, but we had all these really amazing people, and it became this kind of like hodgepodge show that because everybody working on it was so good, it maybe wasn't fully cohesive and working towards a cohesive goal, but it was still like this kind of spectacular thing. And then in the second half, it does very feel much to me like Tomino comes in with a clear vision of this is really what the show is. This is the goal that it's working towards. These are the things we're going to do. And it ends up shaping much more around his voice and his style very consistently in that entire second half.
100%. And, I've been working ahead a little bit for the second half of this season and doing all the notes on Zeta Gundam. And, you put the timeline here. Tomino started Zeta Gundam early, like around the time Heavy Metal L-Gaim starts broadcasting.
Yes.
And I think you can very much see, if you put the timeline together, that part of why it snaps into place is I do think he is working through a lot of his ideas for Zeta Gundam in the second half of L-Gaim. I don't think it's just this show feels like that. I think there are literally thematic things, because if you look at his early memos and stuff, it took him a while to nail down what he wanted Zeta Gundam to be, like who the main character would be, how prominent certain legacy characters would be, all this stuff. And I think like one of those is that I think Daba snaps into place as kind of a proto-Char in Zeta Gundam. Now,
yes,
tonally different, obviously, because Daba is our hero, not our, kind of future anti-hero. But I do think the idea of the displaced prince with those kind of Hamlet-esque qualities, deciding how far he's going to go, up to and including dropping asteroids on a planet, all of that, and if you look at those memos, the character Tomino is most interested in going into Zeta Gundam is Char. That's the person who there's something in his head he can't get out, and he wants to talk about Char. And I think you have that. I think you have all the stuff that this show becomes about men and women, and the way women are subjugated by men, which becomes one of the main themes of Zeta Gundam. It very much does feel like as he is writing the plot for Zeta Gundam, he is also doing L-Gaim part, the second half of L-Gaim, and I think those things are very much complementary.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it definitely does become, L-Gaim is like a very grandiose display of that central Tomino, or one of Tomino's central character archetypes, which is the female character who is psychologically dominated by men in power. And that becomes, it's the whole story of L-Gaim. And that's like one of the things I was excited to see, because that's very much, that is the thread that Super Robot Wars Y takes, and all of the L-Gaim stuff in Super Robot Wars Y, where they actually end up creating a bunch of scenes of that game that I had thought would be scenes in the show, but are not, is just going along that line and picking out how, obviously Olvi is like that, but of course Posaydal herself is like that, Full Flat is like that. It is like the original sin of this world are men dominating and using women and setting them up as figureheads and then dropping them like flies when they do not need them. And it is just like, that is very much a central theme of Zeta Gundam as well, and of a vast majority of Tomino's body of work. But in some ways, this is the one where it feels like he's like, I'm putting this at the center. Like, this is the pillar that is holding up the show L-Gaim ultimately. And it's interesting because you would not ever, I think, near the beginning of the show, think that that's where it was going to go. It was a thing I was very fascinated by, knowing those plot twists would happen eventually, being like, when is this going to become more central? Because I knew it would happen. And I was very worried at some point that I was like, oh God, please don't let this just be a Zambot 3-esque, just the last episode does this, and you're like, and this is what the show was about, I promise, and then it just ends, and I was kind of very nervous it was going to turn into that. And then pretty soon into this batch of episodes, those fears were alleviated, because he clearly is laying lots of the groundwork. We'll get into, you like transliterated the scene, that is the scene where it feels like Tomio's like, I have to start planting these seeds right now, because this is what the show is about. But it just does end up becoming this fascinating precursor to Zeta Gundam and Double Zeta and Char's Counterattack and Victory, which are all very interested in this kind of central character idea of the relationship between men and women, men in power and women being subjugated, and what that means and how that reflects on society.
You also start to get some hints of his interest that will really flourish in Turn A Gundam, of like gender fluidity. Yes. Particularly with the just dynamite brain-blowing moment where Posaydal looks, I forget which character it is, I think it might be Ney Mohan, dead in the eye and says, I am not a woman, I am a man. Huh. And it's like, and that becomes this, because that's before you know the full scope of what Posaydal is, but there's this questioning of like, what is her essence? Is it feminine or masculine? And this is like a tension throughout the last half of the series. And it's stuff like that where I'm going like, and now I'm just thinking about Lauren/Laura/ it's like, there's a lot of the future of Tomino in this show. And, I just think this is a series where if you have any love for Gundam, if you have ever enjoyed a Tomino show, if you just like mech shows because you like the mechs and you like looking at them, this is a show you need to watch. This is a show you need to get in your life. Particularly on that point about the mechs. Oh my, I know we sung the praises last week, but like this show, Sean, is Mount Rushmore of mech designs, right? Like it is one of the absolute best all-time, full stop.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah. Like if you want to see cool mechs do cool mech shit, like this is the show you gotta watch. It's like, and it's fantastic that the show has all these other narrative things too. Yeah. But like, I think the thing that's amazing, we talked about last week, that the first half felt like, it's got fun characters, it has cool story stuff, but it's primarily that first half of an aesthetic experience and about engaging in the aesthetic and kind of drowning in the gorgeous aesthetic of the show with the music, the character designs, the mech designs, the animation, the action, storyboarding, all that stuff so excellent. And it's a real treat that all that stuff continues. And it's like, it is just as good, if not better, in all those regards of the second half. And then all these narrative complexities get layered on top of it. But it is definitely, you're sitting there like thinking about the nature of power or whatever it is, in whatever like heady conversations just being had, and they're like, oh my god, look at this, look at the ATOL, oh my god, this is a fucking beauty of a mech, and look at the cool lightsabers and the big lasers, and like the fucking laser effects are so gorgeous in this show, and it is just a true joy for all senses.
I remember vividly, we watched Zeta Gundam for the first time on Weekly Suit Gundam back kind of in the middle. This would have been around the time, it would have been like right after, I guess, Rise of Skywalker came out. So it'd be right after the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And I remember the scales kind of falling from my eyes watching Zeta Gundam going, oh, Star Wars ain't fucking shit. This show knows how to do a sequel. Yeah. And I kind of felt that with L-Gaim too. Like, back to even more like fundamental Star Wars I love, where I'm like, oh, you could have a lightsaber that's a whip. You could have someone whip their lightsaber. You could have 3 lightsabers all whipping and wrapping around something. Oh my god, that's amazing. And then there's also more substantive narrative stuff that this show does. Like, I think this show gives Daba Myroad the ending that Luke Skywalker should have had at some point in the story, which is the walk off into the sunset as everyone is worried about him, thinking they'll never see him again. Yeah, it's just stuff like that. This show, man, anime is awesome.
Yeah, anime kicks ass. This is definitely, I mentioned it last time with the L-Gaim, that it's just a crime that George Lucas never saw L-Gaim before he made the prequels, because, as cool as the lightsaber stuff is in the prequels, how much cooler could it have been if he had incorporated like half of this shit. I mean, it is crazy that L-Gaim does just full up, straight on have double-bladed lightsabers. Like, they're not prominently featured, but they do pop up a couple of times. And I do wonder if this is the first time that, like, very specific idea has appeared. You do have the beam naginata in the original Gundam with Char's Gelgoog, which is sort of a double-bladed lightsaber-esque thing, but they're like curved blades. Here, it's just a lightsaber, but it's two-sided.
It's just Darth Maul's lightsaber 15 years before Darth Maul, yeah.
Exactly, and I do wonder if this is the first time that ever appeared, because when it popped up, I was like, oh. It's like, we all, you know, love Darth Maul and you know, that scene, but, you know, Darth Maul didn't do it first. I don't know if L-Gaim did it first, but it did do it before Darth Maul.
I mean, again, imagine if, you know, General Grievous, his thing wasn't just a bunch of individual lightsabers, but he had fucking lightsaber whips, and Obi-Wan had to fight him, one lightsaber against three. You know, it's just, there's a lot of...
But also, what if General Grievous was like a hot androgynous lady to like physically dominated Obi-Wan Kenobi? You know, like Full Flat does to Daba in what is one of my favorite episodes of the show. That would just be so much better.
All right. Well, Sean, do you want to kick off with kind of a continuation of our history section? Because the thing is, getting into more of the history of this and some of L-Gaim's footprint on the world does get us closer to some of the thematic things this show is about, as we'll see.
Yes. Yeah. So which history note do you want to start with here, Jonathan?
Let's just go through it the way you have it on our outline here. I mean, let's mention how the ending came about, and then I do want to talk about the Nagano Mamoru of it all and 5-star stories and all of that.
Yes. Yeah. Because it's very fun stuff. So first of all, just a note on the ending. And I was very curious to get to the end because I knew this was a thing, but I just didn't know how it would manifest in the show. So originally, L-Gaim was scheduled to have 50 episodes, which is a fairly standard count for a 4-core series, right? You'd be 50 to 52 is normally what a 4-core series would have. However, it was eventually expanded to have 54 episodes. Now, if you do line this up, L-Gaim is 50, its successor show is also 50 episodes. So if you're doing a full year, there are kind of 4 episodes floating there. Now, not every show, you know, sometimes has like a week off for like New Year's Eve and stuff like that. So who knows, like I didn't go through that thoroughly, but this is not that uncommon. Like when you see these sorts of like unusual episode counts, if you look at the shows on either side of it, usually there is something else that's like, oh, there's an episode pulled here and given here, 2 episodes here, 2 episops there. Is usually how this kind of scheduling works out.
So yeah, just to put it plainly, 54 plus Zeta's 50 is 104, and you cut that in half and you have 52. So
exactly. Now the details around some of like why this has 54 episodes are not entirely clear to me because the original source of this information is from like a magazine or like a physical article that has not been published online. So I found a couple of sources of people interpreting that information. One of the main ones is from the Japanese Wikipedia page, but the way that it's written there I found very confusing, but I found a couple other places talking about it. And so I kind of tried to read between the lines of what's going on here. So the implication I found from the phrasing of how people mention this, who are talking about the article, talking about this information, is that I believe the production requested these additional episodes, that this was not a, like, let's say Macross situation where the original Macross ended up with an entire extra core of episodes because it was so popular. And it was not necessarily a thing that they were like fully prepared to do. But it was like, we have the scheduling stuff. The show is a huge fucking hit. Here's 13 more episodes. Go make it. I don't think it's anything like that. I think this is closer to what happened with Mobile Suit Gundam, where they were like getting closer to the end they looked at what they had left and they're like, we need some more episodes. There in Mobile Suit Gundam, it was partially because their original episode count got cut back and then they fought back for 4. Here, I believe, is just like, we know the show is popular, they were doing well. And I think when you watch the home stretch of episodes, it becomes clear there are too many pieces on the board that, like, I think Tomino could have wrapped it up in 50 episodes if he really wanted to. But I think it's clear that there's just like, there was enough stuff that needed to be expanded on that they needed those 4 additional episodes. The result of this extension specifically can be seen around episodes 49 and 50. So in episode 49 is where we have Operation Stardust kicks into action and the meteors strike Sfeto and Gusgall, and the heroes get in on planet side, and there's that whole scene where they go and infiltrate Sveto, and they overhear Posaydal in full flat talking and all that kind of stuff. And then in episode 50, they are suddenly in space again. And then you have a whole episode 50, where they're in space, and Amu goes and confronts full flat. And then in episode 51, they go back to Sveto. And so I think that's where the surgery is happening, where they are kind of connecting some of their original plans with what the new expanded ending is. And that's one of the reasons why there's this kind of weird, we're on the planet, now we're in space. Oh, and then now we're on the planet again. And they kind of I think it's the only place where there's a little bit of awkwardness around it. Otherwise, I think the show uses these additional 4 episodes incredibly effectively. If you were not told that the show had an extended episode count, I don't think you'd ever be able to tell.
I would agree, and the really the awkwardness for me, and it's not, again, overall I think it's the right choice. It's not so much 49 as even that they're on the planet and they go back into space. It's that 49 feels like a penultimate episode. 49 is pedal to the metal. It's where you first have a full Amandara, full flat, Mion kind of triangle standoff. You have the big scene where McTomin is about to die, and then you have what's his name? Heckler steps in to be saved. That's also one of the most clearly expensive action scenes in the whole thing, because you have Daba carve up the fucking other mobile suit, like that scene in Mugen Train, the Kimetsu movie, where Rengoku goes in and carves up Asuka, and it's how are they fucking doing this on TV? It's nuts. And so it does feel like, oh, we're about to be done. But I remember watching 49 and going, they can't wrap this up in one episode. What's going on? Yeah. And then I do because episode 50 is a good example of one where you could cut episode 50 from a plot standpoint in so much as it doesn't necessarily change the status quo, but I think it does absolutely crucial character work for Amu and Gable that you need for the ending to land. And that's where I think the extra episodes help, is just having extra room to breathe with the characters so that the plot isn't just a plot ending, but it is a fuller ending for all of our main characters.
Yeah, and I think especially if L-Gaim was going for a kind of gut punch style ending, like a Zeta Gundam or Victory, or Char's Counterattack, where it's we're going for a really big striking final moment to land on. I think you could have done the just 49-50 and had the side characters not have a complete resolution. It would have been fine. But because the ending of L-Gaim is this softer, we've won the day, but our heroes can never really come back from what they've experienced, and Daba walks off into the sunset to kind of walk away from this world and to prevent himself from falling into the same cycles of what he was just fighting against. It's a great ending, but it's a much softer ending. And it's such a character-based ending that you really need to have all time for all of the different cast of characters, which by the end of the show is very plentiful with very rich characters, to all reach their natural conclusion. And so it's I think characters like Giwaza, Amu, Leshy, Gable, Olivi, those characters would not have been well served at all by 49-50. I think Mion, Full Flat, Amandra, and Daba could have had perfectly fine endings, but the rest of the cast would not have worked with only having episodes 49 and 50, whatever that original episode 50 would have been. I think it's those last 4 episodes are there to give the whole cast of characters their kind of final pieces of character development they need to make that ending resonate well.
Well, because part of that is I think Daba becomes less and less and less of the main character as this show goes along. He is the protagonist. He is a central driver of action. But one of the things it does that I think makes the show so dynamic is that the more he becomes Kamon Myroad and less of Daba Myroad, the less you get a sense of his internality. You get closed off from knowing him as a person because he's kind of closing himself off. And because the ending isn't anything about Daba reflecting on himself. He might be doing that, but we just don't see it. It is Amu and Lessie talking about Daba as he walks away. You need to have that extra time with those characters, and I think that's what makes it work. I think that softer ending would be tough if you didn't have the room to flesh out the supporting cast, who have really become our anchors emotionally into this world at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the Nagano Mamoru of it all, because we got things to go through here.
Yes, because so we mentioned on last episode about Nagano's path to being one of the primary creative talents behind L-Gaim when he was basically a kid. But I mentioned that we wanted to talk a little bit about where he goes from there, but we would save it for part 2 because his career is just fucking wild. And to be perfectly honest, I don't fully understand it, and I don't know if anybody does. You have to read a lot of manga, I think, to fully wrap around what this guy was like. So we will pick up some bits and pieces of his future role as a mech designer on later Tomino shows, like Zeta Gundam. But L-Gaim also serves as a starting point for what is Nagano as a creator, his most defining work, which is the manga 5-Star Stories and the things that go along with it. So the 5-Star Stories is a manga born from a series of narrative ideas and setting details that Nagano wanted to incorporate into L-Gaim but couldn't. As he worked on L-Gaim, he developed an urge to not simply design elements for a story, but to tell the actual story himself. And from that urge, he began creating his manga, The 5-Star Stories, which debuted in monthly new type in 1986 and has been running since. So this is all, almost concurrent with L-Gaim. The series has been collected in 18 volumes to date, but that number really undersells it because there are a wide number of side stories and design books that go with the series and stuff like that. It's like a whole ecosystem unto itself kind of, property. 5-Star Stories seems like an absolutely crazy, wild series. It had a strange soft reboot in 2013 where Nagano changed various narrative and setting details, and he has also revisited earlier chapters in some seemingly dramatic ways. As an outsider who has not read any of the manga, to be perfectly honest, I find it very hard to wrap my head around what the fuck it is. Just when you're trying to read people describe, then he reboots it, but it's not really a reboot because it's a different continuity, but it's the same kind of it just seems fucking crazy. And to add even more to the mystique, this is something I've known about for a while, and I just fucking love this. He also directed and wrote an animated movie that is set in the world of the 5-Star Stories, which was released in 2012, called Gothic Maid, all one word in full caps. It's the only way you can write that title. However, for all intents and purposes, it is not possible for anyone to actually go watch Gothic Maid, as has never been released for home video or streaming. The explanation for that has been that the amount of data that it is too much to be released. Now, I don't know if that makes any fucking real world sense. Maybe you could hit on that in a little bit, Jonathan. But the point being, the only way one can see this movie is its occasional periodic theatrical screenings that have been done in Japan since its release, including most recently the most prominent of that being a full 10-day revival run done in 2022. Now, I wanted to do more research on Gothic Maid, but it was driving me fucking crazy and I couldn't wrap my head around what was being said. Jonathan, did you have something you wanted to add?
So, you want to guess how many reviews Gothic Maid has on Letterboxd, Sean?
I don't know.
11. It is the lowest number of reviews I've ever seen for a movie on Letterboxd because, of course, very few people can see it, and Letterboxd is mostly in English, so you're relying on basically English speakers or people who speak English who have been in Japan during one of the times that Gothic Maid was in theaters in the last 10 years. Gothic Maid was one of its marketing things is it was one of the first, and to this day, one of the only anime that was actually produced in 4K, native 4K. To this day, most anime is 2K that is then upscaled if it gets any kind of 4K release, because, to be perfectly honest, the way anime is done does not really need 4K resolution. It's just not fully necessary, but that's part of it. I'm guessing the whole thing about the data is that. Now, I think that's bullshit. I don't think that's true, obviously, but because it's a 70-minute movie. It's not long or anything, but that is probably where that comes from, Sean, is my guess, because especially in 2012, there would be nothing else natively produced in 4K in this industry.
Yeah, but I just remember reading, because that is an official quote from the production side of the movie, that it's too much data and therefore we cannot release it on home video because the Blu-ray just can't handle it. Which I'm sure that would be true, except for you can just make a fucking 1080p version. It's fine. It feels like a weird marketing tactic, but it's part of the thing with 5-Star Stories as a whole. Is that it has this mystique. It feels like it is such a unique thing. I haven't properly read any of the manga, but I kind of pulled up some of it online and looked through some of it. And it visually is structured unlike manga. It's hard to describe, but it's just the way the paneling works and stuff like that. It just feels like Nagano kind of went down his own very unique path. And has kind of been way down it on his own, making a very, what from the outside looking in seems like a very auteur-driven even in the world of manga, a very auteur-driven, very unique, special kind of thing. And I'd love to actually properly read it at some point. It is still ongoing, like it's not done. He's still making more of it. And I would also love to see Gothic Maid, but I don't know if that will ever be humanly possible. But I do just adore the idea that in the year of our Lord 2026, that there is a modern movie, made in recent times that is one that you just can't see. Like you can't, not only can you not buy an official release of it, you can't pirate it. It's not online. Like there's no way. Maybe there's like a cell phone video of it someone took somewhere at some point in a theatrical screening. But that's the only means by which someone could watch Gothic Maid other than to actually go see it in a theater. And that's fucking crazy. And it's sometimes it's a little bit annoying because I'd love to see the movie, but it also, I kind of love it because it's fucking crazy.
Yeah, and I don't know how much this is completely unique to Gothic Maid. It's a Toho release, and they have a program they call Dream Pass, which is their like rerun system where they run some stuff in theaters, and that's probably what that like 2022 thing was also. And I think there might be a couple other things that are kind of under that banner, but it is definitely a weird thing. I also just wanted to note, Sean, though, with the 5-star stories, it's had a weird English release history. If you're thinking about all this and like, I want to read 5-star stories, it does have a pretty long English release that was issued by the brand Toys Press in the early 2000s. It released the first 10 volumes of the Japanese manga, but broken into 26 English volumes, because those were really thin, tall printings, sort of similar to American comic books that you'll get, the trade presses that are like 60 pages or something, like that thin. And so that's how it was originally released. But those are very, very deeply out of print. They're really rare. Copies go for very high prices. I looked this up on eBay. The only one I could find was Volume 2, and was going for $150. So you're not going to get the Toys Press versions. But in just a few weeks from when this podcast is coming out, the 5-star stories is beginning a new run in English from Titan Manga, which will correspond to the original 18 Japanese volumes, assuming, it gets that far. But Volume 1 is coming out on July 7th. The front cover bills that as the 1998 edition, and if you're wondering, was there another reboot in between 86 and the 2012? No. What that means, because I had to look all this up, is that this is the original version, not the reboot after Gothic Maid. It's just that volumes 1 and 2 of the manga were reissued in Japan as 1998 and 2005 editions, respectively, which don't change the content, but add expanded and revised lore and appendix info, because that's one of the things 5-star stories is known and celebrated for, is having a, Tolkien level of lore and timelines and stuff, so that'll presumably all be in there. There is also a one-off 5-star stories movie that was made in 1989 by Sunrise, directed by Yamazaki Kazuo, and it covers the first arc of the manga. It's 66 minutes long. It released on a double bill with the film adaptation of the light novel series Utsunomiko by the author Fujikawa Keisuke, and it is the only anime adaptation of 5-star stories to date. I actually watched this last night. Have you seen this movie, Sean?
No, I did download it because I was curious, but I have not taken the time to actually watch it.
It's something that anyone who liked L-Gaim should watch, if for no other reason than it's got the Nagano art style. It is one of the most gorgeous things I have ever seen in animation. It is like peak 80s Sunrise, absolute height of their powers, full movie quality. There's not a lot of action in it until the end, but when you get there, the main mech, which is the Knight of Gold, that you have our main character get into, it's just a couple minutes, but it might be the best animation of a mech I've ever seen in anything. It's just unreal how good the animation is at the end of that movie. So it's very, very satisfying. It is also, though, the tip of the iceberg of this larger story. So it kind of feels almost like you're watching an amazing pilot and you're like, good, I can't wait to see more of this story, but there is no more in anime, which is too bad, both because of the animation and because of the cast. One of the main characters, Lachesis, is Kawamura Maria, as you would expect from a Nagano production, but then also, that movie has 3/4 of the Dragon Ball Z big bads in it. It's got Horikawa Ryo, it's got Wakamoto Norio, and Nakao Ryusei, and Horikawa, who is Vegeta in Dragon Ball, this is one of his earliest roles, and for a guy who is best known for playing the hyper-masculine Vegeta, Prince of the Saiyans, he's playing the main character of 5-star stories, a guy named Soap, who is completely effeminate. like Soap presents completely feminine but has a male voice and like uses male pronouns, but it is this very like gender bent thing. And so Horikawa is doing this very soft high register thing with his voice. It's like very uncanny to hear. Just the whole cast is like all Japanimation station faves. It's a really interesting film and made me definitely want to read the manga and see more of this stuff. And I'm curious if Sunrise will ever go back and do more with 5-star stories, because it would be cool to see. And I wonder if it's kind of a Berserk situation where the manga has been going so long, but in such weird fits and starts that it's kind of hard to know what to do with it in animation, you know?
Yeah, it does just strike me as like a quintessentially cult kind of property, you know, that it's just so kind of unique and insular, and yeah, like it's something I'm so fascinated about it looking from the outside, but also that we try to read anything about it, you're like, I can't wrap my head around what is being said here. I think the only way to experience it is just to like actually try to properly read it from the beginning. But yeah, like I do love that Nagano Mamoru. Again, he does stuff outside of this. He does other kind of design work and stuff like that. But like the vast bulk of his creative work in his career has been invested in this just absolutely bonkers manga series and this one crazy fucking movie he wrote and directed that you can't see.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely nuts.
But you can see the 5-star stories movie, so if you want an easy, like, hour-long way to get into it and know what this series is a little bit, I'd highly recommend it. It's especially if you like any Sunrise animation stuff, it's like a must-see, because it's one of Sunrise's literal finest hours of animation.
Yes. All right. But like, continuing with Nagano Mamoru, I want to talk about one thing that in my research I was very excited to get to, but it took me a while to add to my notes because I had a very intimidating stretch of my book to translate. I'm like, oh my god, this shit is hard to translate. But I did it because I just needed to talk about this section. So I want to talk about a thing called the Fatima. Which is a thing that isn't in L-Gaim, but could have been in L-Gaim, and something like it, I guess, is in 5-star stories. So
directly it is in 5-star stories, okay. And I can tell you about it in a little bit here, because I can expand on some of this.
All right. So one narrative element that Nagano wanted to include in L-Gaim that he eventually brought over to 5-star stories, because Tomino vetoed the idea, was the Fatima. The Fatima were android women/living computers that aided in the piloting of the heavy metals. A shadow of this idea persists in the final series, where a silhouette of a human-like figure and a kind of human woman-like figure can be seen in the foreheads of some heavy metals. Most prominently, you see it in the L-Gaim Mark II. It's in like the OP and the eye catches. Near the end, there's a couple of like very big shots and like the shadow kind of like shifts, but the show never explains or does anything with it. It's just kind of a weird visual motif. So that kind of is hanging on there in L-Gaim, but is not really the idea that Nagano really wanted. And Tomino was just not enthused by the idea at all. And we'll get into some quotes about, he gives into shocking detail about why he does not like this, I think is very interesting and gets into it. But what, from having seen 5-star stories, Jonathan, what is this idea like in that movie?
Well, in at least the first arc that movie adapts, the Fatima, that is the core narrative idea of 5-star stories. In the world of 5-star stories, you have, which by the way is called that because it's set in this world where there's 5 solar systems in a cluster, and that's what the 5 stars are. Anyway, and again, kind of like the Pentagonal World thing, yes. Except solar systems, not planets. But anyway, the Fatima are, as you said, they are androids. Basically, they are created women life forms who run the mobile suits in that world, which are called, oh my god, the verbiage in 5-star stories is nuts. I think they're called mortar heads, and then the people who run the mechs are called headliners. They're the headliners, which is fucking great. But anyway, so each headliner has basically a Fatima who becomes their effectively slave and is in that machine, and it's exactly how it is in the L-Gaim opening. They are up in the forehead, basically the third eye area, where if you had a mobile suit had a third eye, and that's where they are, and they basically control it, and then the pilot is like doing some other stuff on the side in synchronization with them, and that's how this works. And the entire plot of the movie, the 5-star stories, is about these 2 Fatima who were created by this old man who is this inventor, and he created 2 of them with free will, so they don't have they're not psychically controlled. And one of them, which is the main Fatima in the story, Lachesis, that's the Kawamura Maria character. She has this relationship from childhood with the main character of the story, Soap. I'm kind of trying not to spoil some things in the here, because so if you're a 5 Star Stories fan and you know I'm oversimplifying this, just please forgive me. And so you have that relationship, and basically the drama of that film is whether Soap will accept Lachesis as his Fatima for his, like, mech and all of that stuff. But because of that, the main action of the film takes place around this sort of like Middle Eastern coded bazaar, and it's basically the Fatima slave auction, and that's what it's dealing with. And so it is specifically about issues of like autonomy, slavery, subjugation. It's hard for me to say where it comes down on all of that, because again, I've only seen what is the very beginning of the story, and I presume it gets complicated in all sorts of ways. One thing that I do think is slightly uncomfortable about what I saw from 5 Star Stories is that it also means there's just a lot of like, you don't see anything like explicit, but there's a lot of like threats of sexual violence against women in the story, particularly the Fatima. And I think that plays into some of what you're going to hear from Tomino in a second here from Sean's translations. So again, I wouldn't judge it one way or the other because I don't think I've seen / read enough. And I think in the movie, it all plays fine, and it would be more like where it would go from there that I would want to know more about. But that's the basic pitch of it. So like, this wasn't just like a little idea that Nagano had. It becomes the key idea of the 5 Star Stories.
All right, so I'm glad you watched the movie so you could explain that, because I didn't. Yeah. Because I knew I wanted to watch the movie at some point and read some of the manga. I didn't want to just read the entire Wikipedia page of it to try to like wrap my head around exactly how the Fatima worked in that. But anyways, so Nagano had this idea. He wanted to use it in L-Gaim. And the fact that he couldn't is one of the reasons why he wanted to do the 5 Star Stories. But he couldn't because Tomino fully vetoed the idea. And he has given 2 different explanations. The first one was initially a very practical one. And this is, I believe, as far as I understand, it's in the same interview. He later goes into far more detail. This is all stuff that I've translated from my On Tomino Yoshiyuki book by Fujitsu Ryota, the anime and media critic. And so I'll give the kind of like Tomino's stuff, and then I have a section I translated from Fujitsu commentary on it, because I think Fujitsu has a very good like kind of breakdown of what's going on here, of why Tomino is so against this. But his initial reasoning for why he rejected it is he said, first of all, it becomes difficult to incorporate a detail like that if it's not brought up during the planning stages, and it also disrupts the already established setting to introduce it partway through. To not accept ideas like that is part of the job of being a director, is what he's implying there, which, you know, I think is a totally fair explanation. It is funny coming from the guy who in most of the stuff we've done, the writers of the show have constantly complained about, like, well, if you just told us what this new type shit was from the start, we would have put it in the show. Or if you just told us what the Ide was from the start, we would have just put it in the show. And the reason why Tomino didn't do that is he didn't really know what he wanted it to be until he got far enough into the show that he knew what he wanted it to be. So he himself is very guilty of being like, actually, this is what this is going to be now, and we are changing the setting detail part of the way through the show. Not to say I don't think that hurts those respective shows, because I think you could do something like this, but
I don't think you could do it with the Fatima. I understand where he's coming from on this. I think if you were to introduce halfway through Heavy Metal L-Gaim slave androids living in the mechs, like, that's a bigger thing than like the new type stuff in Gundam, I think, because it more fundamentally changes like everyone's relationship to everything.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, I think if you wanted to do it, you could pull the biorelation stuff and like what's going on with Mion. Like, you could absolutely have done it. I don't think at all that the reason why he rejected it is not because it was too hard. The reason why he rejected it is for this second quote he gives. Please note that this interview is from like 10 years plus after L-Gaim, so he references some stuff that was not concurrent with L-Gaim, but it was like more recent to when he's discussing this, which is why he brings up some of these references. So Tomino expanded beyond that practical explanation later in the interview, where he said, to put it simply, to treat a young girl character like a puppet, the inclination to incorporate her into a machine is the habit of a juvenile man. I don't even need to mention the example of Giger. I assume he's mentioning H.R. Giger there, of weird, like the psychosexual stuff. He doesn't expand on what he says there. He says, it would be the equivalent of dragging the darkness in the hearts of men out into the public. To do this carelessly, to play with doll fetishism from a male perspective, would be to spread the psychology of Miyazaki Tsutomu, who, for those who don't know, which I did not, he was a serial murderer of young women who was known as the Otaku Murderer because he had an extensive collection of anime, manga, hentai, horror stuff like that. that. So the media sensationalized that as like the reasoning behind his murders.
When you read like histories of the word otaku, his name comes up. I knew that name because it comes up a lot in why otaku has a much more negative connotation in Japan than it does in the West.
Yeah, well, because I was reading this in Japanese, I recognized the kanji for Miyazaki, and initially I was like, that's a really brutal thing to say about Miyazaki Hayao. But it's like, they're like, oh wait, that's not Hayao. That's not Hayao. I should just jump to conclusions reading a surname. This is
a very common surname.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's just kanjis leads you to weird conclusions if you don't think about it too hard. So he says the doll fetishism from male perspective would lead to the spread of this kind of psychology of this serial murderer. He then goes to go even further. This would connect to a tacit approval of the psychological construct of the men of the Om Shinrikyo cult. This is the cult responsible for the 1995 Tokyo subway sarin gas attack. And he said, these men who projected their urgings onto women, and before they knew it, they were turned into an execution squad. The phenomena of nurturing these psychological constructs would then appear in anything that Nagano's hand touched. If you release this out into the public world, it would lead to encouraging the psychology of something like the Om Shinrikyo. I want Nagano to understand that. And that is a hell of a fucking thing to bring up totally offhand in an interview about an anime you made like 12 years ago.
And about your like mentee figure who is now super duper successful with this work. I have thoughts on all this, but maybe you want to do the Fujitsu thing.
Yes. So let me read through. So Fujitsu Ryota then like goes through a big piece where he kind of dissects from his perspective, why is Tomino so repulsed at this idea? Like, why is it so anathema to Tomino that he's just like not only is he saying we can't do this, he gives this very pretty brutal takedown of this whole concept. And so this is what Fujitsu Ryota says. He says, the reason Tomino rejected the Fatima was because Tomino rejects the form of male desire implicated with the, quote, female-shaped robot which equals a doll or puppet. Tomino sees in the Fatima an infantilized worship of women born from an obsession for the mother, and he feels a danger when the object of that worship becomes a doll, where people beyond the self cease to exist. Those people are driven by these desires into a more and more introverted world, and gradually that person begins to turn their back on society. If we look at this from the framework of my thesis, that Tomino's work expresses a worldview where the self uses technology as a medium to interface with the world, the reasoning for his rejection of the Fatima becomes clear. To Tomino, technology is a means where an individual can access and open up a wider world. From the perspective of someone like Tomino, the Fatima, born from technology, takes the polar opposite vector and drives the user into a more insulated, isolated, and introverted world. This insulated perspective is a loss to society as a whole. If an individual is cut off from society and spirals into their own world dominated by their isolated principles, it connects to a criminal psychology. Tomino's perspective is one that believes that contributing to such a technology is dangerous. Tomino's rejection of the Fatima closely resembles his objections to Neon Genesis Evangelion. In regards to Evangelion, Tomino leveled a harsh judgment, even saying it was a work that, quote, produces sick people, which is one of the most brutal one-sentence takedowns ever. It's a very famous quote. And that's very literally what he says, is that Neon Genesis Evangelion is a thing that produces sick people. In Evangelion, as the pilots ride the EVA, robots born from technology, they are depicted as confronting their psychological scars. The work is dyed with a powerful introverted sensibility, and the Evangelions even house the souls of their pilot's deceased mother. There we see the same respect for women concealing an infantile dependency on the mother.
I mean, here's the thing. I mostly agree with Tomino on all of this. Mm-hmm. Like, I wouldn't personally say Evangelion is a work that produces sick people, but that is his prerogative to say that. I do feel bad for anyone who was ever inspired by Tomino, because I think he has insulted all of them at one point or another. But like, yeah, I mean, I basically agree with all of this. I do think Fujitsu is absolutely right, as we've talked about before, in identifying what is the core of Tomino's work and why this, in this analysis, wouldn't work in it. I think he's totally right on that. But I do think as a larger thing, like, I don't know if I would go as far as to say, because I just don't believe there is a one-to-one link between media and committing violence. But I do think I have a similar discomfort with this kind of story about like women in the bodies of robots and some of that stuff. Like, it's one of the reasons why I think Ghost in the Shell is such a remarkable movie, is that it avoids a lot of the pitfalls I think every other story like that does. And I think I had a little discomfort, as I said, with some of the stuff in the 5-star stories, while acknowledging I watched 1 hour of anime and I would not judge. I need to read the full manga to know if I would feel that way in the larger context of the story. So I'm not judging 5-star stories because I don't know enough. I do know Eva. I do know I have some of the same complaints, particularly with the original TV show, that I think the later rebuild kind of, for me, kind of fixes or adjusts to a maybe more mature understanding of the world. But yeah, I completely see where Tomino is coming from, is I guess what I will say.
Yeah, and I do think, that it's something where the impulse of certain kinds of media that target, adolescent men, in creating these female characters that are these kind of like insular outlets for their kind of pent up feelings towards women in all the ways that implies, the maternal stuff, the sexual impulses, stuff like that. And and it's rampant in certain areas of otaku culture, of where you have these, in particular, there's a lot of stuff from like the early 2000s that had this, where you have these kinds of like very passive, like basically dull women that are outlets for those kinds of desires. And that thing, like we saw this, a great work that I think dramatizes this is Welcome to the NHK, which we covered, which looks into the ways in which that can be used as a means of mentally and psychologically escaping from and not having to confront one's own psychological hangups around their, like a men's psychological hangups around their relationship with women. And it allows someone to flee from the world, as Fujitsuryota kind of lays out here. And I like his framing of the sense of when that object of this sort of like worship, as he refers to it there from this male perspective, takes on the form of a doll, this kind of like non-human thing, this thing that doesn't truly have full free will, that is subject to the whims. And please note that the word doll and puppet here are interchangeable in Japanese. So I think you need to kind of see them as being both those. That is a means for certain people to not engage with the world around them and the people around them. And that I do think that very much is a central concern of Tomino. I think it is a thing that if you look at any of his work, particularly his more modern work, as this kind of like the hikikomori and stuff like that became a bigger phenomena in Japan, there is a bigger and bigger interest, I think, on the part of Tomino to try to reach out to a younger generation that is more insular, that is more isolated, and kind of pull them out of that mindset and into a much more practical world. And I think, interestingly enough, this is true of Anno as well with Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Yes.
Because that's exactly what the rebuild movies are, particularly number 4, is completely about, like, you cannot trap yourself in this little psychological cage you've built and hide away from the world and everybody else in it. You have to get out of that and quite literally touch grass. Like, you have to leave and engage with the world and see other people as actual other people. And that's a thing that I think Neon Genesis Evangelion, the TV show, and End of Eva recognizes a failure of Shinji, that he cannot do that. But it's also a work that can't see what is the world outside of that perspective also. It's such a sort of like self-deprecating, self-loathing piece of work, the original TV show and the movie End of Evangelion, that it's so wrapped up in Shinji's own self-deprecation and Shinji's own self-loathing, because I suspect that it is Anno feeling those same kind of emotions.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you can never accuse Evangelion of being is dishonest. It is very honest about where it comes from, right?
Yeah, but it's something where it feels like it's one of the things that I know that we both have issues with the original version of that story, is that it feels like it is maybe too small-minded about the world and needs to kind of open up its perspective more broadly, and that's what it feels like the End of Evangelion, or the rebuild movies do. But I do think it is very telling, and I think it's very accurate what Fujitsuryota lays out here, of like expanding on the reasoning Tomino gives, that this sort of concept is so anathema to Tomino's worldview. And I don't think that like this is an idea that you cannot or should not express in media because it's dangerous, but I think it's a thing that Tomino can't do because it's just something that's not part of his worldview at all. And I do think it's something that if you're doing it, you need to be careful about how you do it, and you're not creating something that is pandering, that is sort of just giving into a very simple, small-minded outlook on the world and outlook on women and their relationship towards men, and using it as this kind of coping mechanism for people who are not able to break out of those kinds of shells.
But then that also brings us to sort of the inevitable question that arises from this, I think, is what is the major difference in how L-Gaim, the series, deals with this? Because it is also a show, ultimately, about these women who are being controlled by men. It does use the word ningyo a lot near the end to describe the word doll/puppet, depending on, who's subtitling it, to describe Posaydal and /Mion and Full Flat and kind of their relationship to Amandara, Amandra, and all of that kind of stuff. And, I do think there is a meaningful difference, but, I can also see where people could kind of look at this and go, is this kind of the pot calling the kettle black, That's why I thought it would be worth talking about that here.
Yeah, well, I think one of the key differences is that Tomino is not constructing a literal doll. He is depicting a situation where men in power are trying to turn women into dolls, right?
Yes.
He is incorporating he is putting the equivalent of, as he's saying here, the men of the Om Shinriko cult or Miyazaki Tsutomu, the otaku murderer. He is putting men with that kind of psychology into the story as antagonists. And because I do think, particularly at this point in his career, it feels like Tomino's fundamental perspective is that, the root of so many, if not all, of the most major issues in society are caused by men in power dominating women and controlling society and manipulating people in that way. And that, and I do think that this is super deeply tied into the fact that he's a father of two girls, and that I think he is seeing the world and is very fixated on this idea of society as one where women are ending up being subjugated by men in power and they're being used as tools, and that the women that you see that are seemingly in positions of power so often are being set up in that way by men. This is I was thinking about this relatively recently with all the Microsoft stuff. This is kind of a dumb example of but with Xbox, where people are bringing up that term of the glass cliff, that you have these executives like Sarah Bond who end up being used as these kinds of fall people for other CEOs who are maybe more culpable for damage to the brand, but you kind of jettison this woman who is in this position and use them as this kind of sacrificial lamb. And I do think there is something with Tomino where he fundamentally sees the world in this way, and he's so interested and kind of fixated on trying to explore this dynamic and depict this dynamic through his storylines. And you see it to certain extents in Mobile Suit Gundam with characters like Lala. You see it more in Xabungle with Elchi. I think you do see it in Dunbine, not with the psychological, psychic power domination stuff, but you do see it with characters like Garalia in Dunbine. Is very much in that situation where she is someone who is totally manipulated by people like Burned Bunnings in order to be this fall person. You have, I'm blanking on the name of the character, but the character that's voiced by Elchi, Musi Po, is absolutely that for Shot Weapon. And then here, it is the original sin of this entire setting, is that this guy, Amandra Commandra, or the real Oldna Posaydal, has, in order for him to protect himself, in order for him to be someone who can actually manipulate the world for his own petty pleasures, basically, has set up this woman as this figurehead that he can hide behind while he psychologically dominates her, and basically is doing that to a lesser extent with Full Flat as well, and is manipulating everything behind the scenes. And I think part of the concern of the plot of Heavy Metal L-Gaim is, will Daba end up in that same position with his own relationship with Amu, his own relationship with Leshy? Is it the fate of all men of power in a society like this to abuse and manipulate and control the women that care for him? And that's the thing that Daba ultimately chooses to walk away from, because he can't find, he's too wounded or something to find a different path. But I know I'm kind of rambling, but to me, that is what the ideas that he's trying to explore and express and identify, this sort of central flaw in society of how half the people in that society are treated purely on the basis of their gender.
I would totally agree with this, and I think part of it also is that you kind of have to look at the direction of our protagonists and antagonists here, because one of the central thrusts of the story for the heroes is trying to figure out what's going on with these women, be they Full Flat or Posaydal, and in some ways liberate them from this. But I also think it's interesting who moves in which direction on that. Like, this is one of the things that I think the expansion to 54 episodes really benefits is Amu and her fascination with Full Flat, where she sees something else in this woman who she kind of views as obviously an enemy to some degree, but also some kind of mentor figure that none of the men on the ship can. And that Full Flat doesn't even necessarily want to admit to. But it is this kind of like mirrored thing where obviously one of the big gestures the show makes is that you learn that in the past there was this triangle with the original Posaydal / Amandra and then Mion and Full Flat. And those three created the world we see now, while you have a similar sort of threesome trying to remake the world in Daba Myroad plus Amu plus Leshy. And Leshy and Amu are both kind of moving around Daba in ways almost to avoid some of that. Like, Leshy winds up striking out on her own because she fears the kind of like desire that is going on there. All of that stuff. And so you have some really interesting material there. I also think what they do with Gavlet Gabale in the last arc of this series, where they give him to some degree a redemption arc, where his fealty / love for Kuasan Olabi kind of moves him to the side of the angels, and that he does the right things down the home stretch of the show. He helps the right people. He helps defeat, his ship, the Slender Scala, is like key in defeating Giwaza at the end of the show. All of this stuff. He kind of finds the nobility that he wanted earlier, but he also doesn't know what to do with it at the very end, I think is really interesting. I think one of the most like brutal, biting lines of the entire show is in the final scene where Gable has returned Olabi to Daba. He has nominally done the right thing, and Amu even comments on that. And then he says, well, she calls me brother, not Gable-san. That is not my intent. And again, I just think there's something so fucking biting in that kind of treatment of Gable as the knight who does kind of want the doll. Well, he does kind of want her for himself, right? He does want to like claim the maiden and go home, and he can't. And Daba's, if you call it whatever you want to call it here, maybe it's heroism, whatever it is going off into the sunset to take care of this broken person and kind of abandon the leadership mantle. And there's a lot of like complicated emotions wound up in all of there that is, I think, Sean, you're identifying the right thing. It is critiquing the kinds of ideas that Tomino 10 years later in this interview would critique with the doll fetishism thing. I think those ideas are already very much on his mind, even if it hasn't necessarily manifested in a lot of media yet at the time of L-Gaim.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see in some of those other places, like with Gable, where I think part of Gable's heroism in the home stretch is his willingness to let Olabi go. That even though he has this desire for her, he does not want to dominate her. He does not want to control her, which is the impulse that so many of the other men in that world have. One of the other ones, of course, is you have Giwaza in his relationship with Nei Mohan, where you have that fantastic episode where Nei goes back to Giwaza, old Posaydal lets her go, with orders to go kill Giwaza. But I think you, as the viewer, clearly are meant to read that she does not want to and is not going to do that. But Giwaza is so obsessed and so, paranoid and afflicted with these suspicions that he doesn't even give Nei Mohan a chance to talk to him or to try to justify it. He just is like, I cannot trust her. She needs to be murdered, and that's it. And I need to kill her. And it is something where, Giwaza could have used Nei Mohan. She would have been a valuable soldier in his army, right? He's with a thing that he is running out of at that point in the show. And he just throws her away without giving her even the slightest opportunity, because he cannot trust anybody and only sees people as being tools to be controlled for his own quest for personal power and domination. And so it is just a thing, I think, where you see very consistently this with the antagonists of the show, that they are these people whose goal for power and goal for control come at the cost of the autonomy of the women around them, and that is used as a specific method for which them to gain and expand their own control. And the protagonists are the people who are not only are going to not try to dominate, but are creating a more egalitarian society where where women have as much a role and are as important and contribute as much as anybody else, right? And that, like, Leshy is effectively in an equivalent position to Daba as captain of a ship and a pilot of a heavy metal, right? And is fully autonomous to be able to make her own decisions and pursue her own goals as part of one of the leaders of the rebellion. And it's a fundamental difference in the worldview of the two different sides of the story.
Yeah. Amu also gets to be, like, an incredibly effective pilot by the end of this thing in the L-Gaim. She's the one who kills Lily in one of the final episodes, which is one of the only, like, just outright battle kills you get near the end here, because this is still never a kill-em-all Tomino show, even if it does have a maybe more complicated ending than something like Xabungle or something, right?
For sure. Yeah, it'd be a very different show if you had just everybody running towards the camera and then Kiwaza shows up in the clouds, like, winking at the very end.
Yes. No, I mean, I think this opens us up to a lot of what we need to talk about with the second half of this series, Sean. And, like, I guess where do you want to go with this? We could go into some of the stuff I've written out here, and kind of into the kind of, like, gender politics of it all. That might be a good place to go next. There's obviously also some big character arcs to discuss.
Let's just continue on this thread because I think this is an important thing, because this is a turning point for the show, of this scene from episode 33 you laid out.
Yeah.
And let's use that to transition into some of the other thematic stuff.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I just, noted here is that as soon as you get into the second batch of episodes that we're talking about today, Tomino's voice just comes so far into the forefront, more than it was in those first 26 episodes. You've got, like, the increased Three Kingdoms style political maneuvering, the way Posaydal's forces splinter into these factions with separate power centers, the way it gets a little more serialized. But then amidst all of that, I think the strongest thing is just how much you can feel Tomino rewriting all of the scripts, right? Sean, of just the dialogue is so Tomino. And I think the key scene is, in episode 33, there's this conversation amongst the crew of the Turner that I think is one of those Tomino Rosetta Stone moments, where I cannot imagine putting his entire career in context without doing a deep reading of what is said in this scene. And also, I want to mention how it's directed. It's got this very moody, noirish stage lighting, like these kind of painted shadows, these really dynamic cuts and camera movements, including in the middle of this, there's a set of cuts where the camera sort of drifts in diagonals, almost like it's floating in 0G, which is very different than your standard horizontal or vertical pans in anime, which is kind of a main, semiotic thing that anime will do for a long dialogue scene. But it is the dialogue that makes this peak Tomino. So, Sean, why don't you read out Daba, and I'll read out everything else, because, again, this whole stretch of dialogue is incredible.
All right, so Daba starts the scene saying, "I don't want to fight any more pointless battles. I don't care what it takes. Posaydal must be defeated."
And Semouj says, "Daba?"
Interstellar wars fade out in the course of time, but when powers like Posaydal force unification, they manipulate people to revolt, and wars fueled by hatred repeat. Even knowing this, I couldn't put my spirit into it. Do you know why?
There's a pause. Nobody answers.
Because of Posaydal. The people of Pentagonal have lost their spirit. We couldn't fight like that.
Semouj says, "But we are."
We were devoted to our cause, but we weren't thinking ahead.
Amu says, "I do think about it, about getting married, having kids, growing old together with you."
The men fight blindly for women like you, neglecting the future.
Semouj, "That's not true, Daba. I see. So that's why Posaydal takes the form of a woman."
That's right. By showing that they have a female mentality, they can dominate all.
Kiao says, "So women are more powerful than men?"
Women are destined to inherit the future. Posaydal created a clone as demonstration.
Kiao says, "A clone?" Amu says, "It could very well be." And Semouj says, "So that's Posaydal's facade."
That's right. In facing her, we face the sacred maternal symbol.
Semouj, "So you're saying that we have no chance at victory?" Now, this is long before they know the truth about Posaydal, or even really start to suspect it, although I think the audience is starting to get a clue that something's up with this woman in more ways than we knew at the beginning. But, yeah, I think obviously there are follow-ups and ways this gets changed. I think there's other conversations later in the show that are also very important around this. But there's something about, one, that is just so... that is like in the voice of every memo we've read this season, Sean, of like all of his planning documents and stuff. It feels less like a conversation in the diegesis of the show than Tomino writing through... because this is what he'll often do in his memos, is he'll ask himself a question, try to answer it. He's like in a Socratic dialogue with himself to try to like tease out the ideas of the show, and this feels like one of those Tomino-Socratic self-memos dramatized on screen.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think particularly like Daba's line about interstellar wars fade out in the course of time, but when powers like Posaydal force unification, they manipulate people to revolt, and wars fueled by hatred repeat. Like, that feels like, you know, when I'm reading my museum book and they have those clips from his, you know, notes ahead of like making Xabungle or whatever. Xabungle was the one we read all the way through it because that is the most dramatic, where he is going all the way through in his hotel room, like reasoning
Yes.
out this whole piece, and then having these kind of occasional grand statements about the nature of war, and this sense of like the domination of this sort of imperial power, right? This is another mode where we see Tomino post Mobile Suit Gundam very much thinking about the state of the world in the Cold War and the nature of these sort of like seemingly endless little pocket conflicts that are created by this absolute domination by these like global superpowers that are not that are seemingly invincible. They're seemingly impenetrable, that nothing can move or act against these things, and everybody and everything in the world is at the whims of these incredible technological superpowers that are so wealthy that they dominate everything.
Yes. And when we get to the Zeta Gundam episode, because I've already laid out some of the memos and stuff in our notes, and in one of the planning documents, it's actually in the pitch document, the first formal like proposal that the other people, not the public, but other people would have read. He has a whole section where he just kind of out of the blue muses about the nature of male versus female soldiers. And it's almost identical language to some of what is in here. This idea that, and again, I think you could read this as like being overly gender essentialist, or you can kind of see the larger philosophical ramifications behind it, which I think is kind of what he's interested in, which is this idea of like the future, the like more people being created, time going forward, that sort of thing, which you can see in the, almost like it says the maternal symbol here, the idea that, you know, women, again, in this kind of gendered way, reproduce and have future, and men fight blindly for the present. And this is one of the things he writes about in basically in that Zeta Gundam memo about how men and women are manipulated on the battlefield through this. But Daba is working through the same chain of logic to arrive at this point where he says that, or he gets everyone to realize that this is why Posaydal is in the form of a woman, the sacred maternal symbol. And while they and the audience do not yet know that Posaydal is underneath a man, or a man is controlling her underneath all of that, they're getting at the idea of why would this benevolent seeming dictator take on the form of a woman and instill this sense of hopelessness in the public. And they get to that. And so it primes us for, in a couple episodes, we get that scene where Posaydal says, I'm not a woman, I'm a man. And you get then Amandra Kamandra coming back into the story and realizing his ultimate role in things. And it's the kind of writing only Tomino would do, both in the specific verbiage and sequence of all of this, but I also think the way he has the full-on thematic conversation justifying where the story is going to go before it starts to go there, which is like a crazy thing that a lot of writers don't do, but I think Tomino pretty frequently does, because he does not think linearly the way a lot of storytellers do in terms of the thematic ramifications of things.
Yeah, and I think this scene, you know, especially, again, as someone who knew, like, what the twist is, when I got to this scene, I'm like, oh, Tomino's there. Like, it's like, you know, like, I felt like I was back in the notes for, like, Mobile Suit Gundam or Ideon and reading those sections where it's like Tomino realizes what he wants this new type thing to be. He was like, I have this line of dialogue about like whatever it's like, you know, now at the end of all of this, I realized that, you know, I wanted to have a child with you. I had this line I wanted to have with this character that didn't even end up in Gundam ultimately. And he eventually gets at like, what is the essential thing behind this line he wants to express? And that's the new type stuff. And so in the TV show of Gundam, all of a sudden new types become a thing very close to the end of that show, right? There's like little like intimations of some of the elements of new typeness, but the core idea doesn't actually express itself until fairly late. And this is a moment kind of like that, where it feels like, oh, he didn't really know what he wanted ultimately this to be. He clearly had something stuck in his craw, because all these ideas are there, or, you know, like, Amandra Commandra is meant to be Posaydal from the first time he appears. And if you know that that twist is in the show, it is very apparent on his first appearance that this is the thing that they know. We'll talk about the casting in a little bit. That's part of it. The whole way that character is framed, if you know the twist, like it is very clear that he knows that this is where all this is going to go. But I don't think he, at that point, understood why he wanted these things to be that way. And it's only once you're about this part halfway through and he's starting to write in this dialogue is he, as I think as a creator, fully internalizing and now expressing the fundamental thematic idea he is interested in about this world that is seemingly controlled by this maternal figure, but that is all just a ruse, that is just a facade to placate the populace, and instead really it is yet another instance of a man in power using this sort of dominating authority to control everything, while being impervious to rebuke, that nobody even knows that he's the one who's doing it.
It's also kind of interesting in that as this is all reasoned out, you could, like, the criticism you could level against it for being sort of a gender essentialist reading of philosophy is also kind of pushed back on by the fact that this is the logic used by the villain pretending to be the maternal symbol. So it's also like this closed loop that doesn't tell the full story because this is not actually a maternally dominated world. It's a paternal vision of maternalism, which is like an interesting snake eating its own tail that is there in this. I also think, like, you know, one of the things we talked about, we didn't get into a ton last week, but I think you and I both agreed it's not a big problem with the first half of the show, but the love triangle stuff can get a little tiring in the same way it would get a little tiring in Xabungle. But Tomino knows that because he immediately starts playing with it in the second half here, where like the Amu Leshy stuff, the love triangle dynamic effectively goes away in terms of the competition between them. There's a little bit of that still, but it becomes much more about how those characters, in part because I think Amu and Leshy, Amu especially, I think, becomes much more the POV character of the show, the person you are most, as the audience, associated with on screen, because you know her and her internality best. And so that gets kind of broken open and complicated, which again is priming us for this ultimate thing, which is that this is an echo of 60 years ago, this other love triangle that resulted in this control, this, you know, maternalism through paternalism kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Where I think, yes, that Leshy and Amu are both struggling with these ideas and their feelings with Daba and their kind of concerns about where does this ultimately lead? What future is there? And I do think one of the places where the kind of gender essentialist tendency that can be in these sorts of themes gets very complicated in L-Gaim is the fact that the story isn't ever about, like, procreation. It's not like, you know, Daba, you know, like, I mean, it's basically stated at the end that's like, well, this is the end of the Yarman people, that there's no, that these are the last two, and, you know, Daba's clearly not going to have sex with Allaby and try to have kids with her, because that's, like, fucked up and totally immoral with this woman who's not in a position to be able to give consent for anything like that. And
who they call each other brother and sister. And I know it's stepbrother and sister, but still they see each other as brother and sister.
Yes. Yeah. And so there's that, like, that whole kind of future, that version of it is cut off, and that Amu and Leshy seemingly are never going to be with Daba, and that, like, the goal, the thing that is won at the end is not a, like, you know, Elizabethan theater comedy ending where everyone gets married. You know, it's the exact opposite of that. And that, like, it is not, the goal of this was not to create, like, the stable family unit that can procreate and all that kind of stuff. That there is a more fundamental idea about what liberating the universe from this form of control is and what it means. And that's one of the places where I think this story differentiates itself from other mecha series I have seen that try to do some of these themes and end up being very, very gender essentialist and are about, we got to make the babies. And that's kind of like as far as it goes.
Yeah, no, I would agree with all of that. And it's just, there's a lot of interesting, complicated shit that happens in the second half of this show around all of this material. And yeah, I'm glad we talked through this scene, because this scene is such a, like, patient zero for all this interesting stuff, and is where, again, I think I would love to try to back up the timeline here. It's totally possible that those Zeta Gundam memos I'm talking about were written around the time he's writing this dialogue. It's just so clearly like all in the stew of his mind, and as much as he's probably having to compartmentalize the different modes of being a director of an ongoing show versus planning a show that hasn't yet been made, there's no way to completely separate all that, and it's all there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can also find us over at the Purely Academic Podcast, our potentially educational variety show where we talk video games, movies, TV, and more every month. And you can read my movie reviews and follow everything we release together on the Fade to Lack Substack at www.jonathanlack.com.
And now, back to the show. So I think from this point, I think there's kind of two ways we could go deeper into the show. I think either we could go kind of through the major characters and break it down that way, or go through the different plot arcs and break it down that way. Which do you think would be better, Jonathan?
I think character-based, because you have in our notes laid out the different plot arcs, and you did a very good job with that. But I also don't think this is a stretch of the show that feels plot arc heavy. I think it feels very continuous and fluid. And I think, while the plot is very interesting, what becomes most interesting here to me is the character psychology and some of those movements and those evolutions. And that a lot of the best episodes are because they're built around a certain character. Like, I just kept highlighting in my notes, like, I would write next to an episode number, like, key episode, and it was always because, like, this is the full flat episode where he winds up on Thartstar and she dominates him, and it's incredible for what it reveals about this character. Or this is the Lilith episode where we have the best episode of Dunbine in a different show, or something like that. And so I do think character is king here.
All right, well, let's start then with my favorite character in the show, which is Full Flat. I think Full Flat is just fucking incredible. I think Doi Mika is just giving like a legendary performance here. This is, of course, the same actress who was Marvel Frozen in Dunbine. She's Hayase Misa in Macross, Queen Serenity, Sailor Moon's mom in Sailor Moon, and then Kobe in One Piece. We talked about her a little bit last week, but Full Flat is only in a little tiny piece of the first half. And I was very pleased and honestly surprised by how fully featured she was in the second half. I didn't think this character was going to be that big because she's only in a little tiny bit of Super Robot Wars Y. But I think she ends up being the kind of most essential pillar of the show in so many ways in the second half, because I think so much of the thematic material rests on her shoulders. And the character, like, the more she appears, the more and more interesting she becomes. And one of those pieces is in the kind of like gender dynamics of the show, the character becomes more and more kind of androgynous coded to me, that she has this sort of, she's on the Thartstar, which is this sort of like Amazon, women paradise, but she's, kind of this very masculine character that Doi Mika has that kind of voice, that it feels like she puts a lot of kind of like a sort of masculine twist on her performance. But also has, that kind of that duality of both elements, that she does have this sort of seemingly very like motherly sort of element to her deep underneath that she's bearing, but has this very powerful, authoritative, controlling element to her as well. And of course, we learned that she has this ultimate sort of plan that is the essential plan, that really she's kind of the most important character to arriving at the conclusion that she is the one ultimately working against Amandra / the original Posaydal and trying to liberate Mion, who was her friend in the Second Saint War decades and decades ago. But I think Full Flat's most outstanding episode is the episode named after her, which is episode 40, Full Flat, which that episode, if you told me that Dezaki Osamu did a like guest episode on Heavy Metal L-Gaim, I would 100% believe you. That one was actually directed and storyboarded by Imagawa Yasuhiko, who's the Mobile Fighter G Gundam guy, and he's great. He's done lots and lots of episodes. I assume Tomino did some on there as well. But it felt like an intentional stylistic call back to, or like not call back, but like a reference to, or an homage almost to Dezaki Osamu, where you have like the scene where Full Flat and Giwaza are having their meeting with each other, where this is the episode where they create that alliance. Giwaza gives Daba as like this sort of gift in a fucking like, ancient Greek war, like the Iliad kind of way. It's like, here's this gift to you upon our meeting to commemorate this alliance. But they have this meeting where they're sitting across a dining table, and you have this pan, and it's very theatrically lit in the sense of like, it's like the fucking table is under a goddamn spotlight. You have all these people around the table with them, and then Giwaza says, I want to speak in private. And then it cuts, they're the exact same place, but all the other people are gone, and they continue their conversation. They, clearly both of these people are lying out their asses, and they both know that they're lying. They both know this is an alliance of convenience that they're both willing to abandon at a minute's notice, but they're working towards their own goals, and it is, advantageous for it to be perceived for them to have an alliance. It's very Romance of the Three Kingdoms of like, nobody ever really has an alliance with fucking anybody in this world. Everybody's out for their own schemes and their own pursuits of power. This is the thing that Amu is most like sort of disillusioned by with Full Flat ultimately, is that Full Flat is not that different from these other men who are willing to manipulate, lie, abuse, scheme in order to further their own aims and further their own control. But then that scene culminates in them like crossing their arms with a cup of wine, sipping the wine, and then they both throw it towards the camera, and the two glasses land right in front of the camera at the same spot. And the only thing that they don't do to make it feel like a super heightened Dezaki Osamu scene is it does not cut to a postcard memory version of that with like super detailed the glass and it freeze framing.
But later in the episode, yes, you get a Dezaki postcard shot that I wrote Dezaki all over my notes here, because you've got the saber fight between Full Flat and Daba that ends the episode in her room at night. It ends in this big Dezaki style postcard shot of them like having passed each other, that kind of samurai movie thing where they've both cut, but you're waiting to see who falls. Then this thin white heartbeat line like comes up on screen, and then in full silhouette, Daba finally falls, and the ending is her putting him in her bed, and that's the end of the episode. And I just wrote, across a third of my page, I wrote wow in giant letters, because, yeah, and the scene you were talking about earlier, Sean, was so good. I drew like a little diagram of it to make me remember where the glasses fall and stuff, because yes, this isn't even, I think this is probably the best directed episode of the show, but it's not even that unusual because there's so much good direction down the home stretch of this show, everywhere.
Yeah, and that ending scene of this episode, that's where like the gender dynamic stuff goes fucking crazy, because it's like, it's such a great scene because Daba like sneaks into basically her private chambers where she's sitting there in like, negligee basically. And so there's this very intimate, it immediately, in my English teacher brain, it makes me think of Hamlet going into his mother's bedroom, in that very, very famous scene. And there's this like kind of intrusive element of it, and this very, this man going to a woman's private chambers. But then it totally flips the gender dynamic on its head, because it is Full Flat as this, again, like, she's not in dominatrix garb, but it's this very dominatrix coded thing of her having this whip and her like basically manhandling Daba. And, we've talked about it before that if you want to get into the sexuality of Tomino, he's clearly a masochist, and he has this tendency for these, like, creating these dominating women characters. And Full Flat very much feels like she is in that tradition, like a Harudu from Ideon, or the character from Daitarn 3, whose name I'm blanking on. But she beats Daba in that battle. And then the gender dynamics fully flip, where the way that sequence is shot, where she defeats him, and then she picks him up and is cradling him in her arms like he's a princess and she's a knight, and she lays him on her bed like he's fucking Sleeping Beauty. Like, it's such an amazing sequence where the whole gender dynamics of that sequence becomes so jumbled and so mixed and so kind of richly, again, androgenized, and then ends with this full gender reversal where she is in this totally masculinized position and Daba is fully in this like feminized position, which is not a thing that that they do with that character. He's so impotent and so powerless in the face of Full Flat. He can't do anything to her in that moment. Because this after he tries like escape twice earlier on and he just can't fucking do it. She's just completely toying with him, and it's just a very powerful moment that she very decisively overpowers and defeats him. And I think it just casts full flat in this fascinating light where she is this such a powerful person, such an authoritative figure in this world, that when later Amandra Commandra visits Thart Star and you get this implication of this prior relationship, you get the sort of the sense of there is something deeper going on here. And there's a kind of fear that Full Flat expresses towards Amandra that's very unsettling because she's so powerful. And then you have the other, I think, kind of key moment with this character is in the episode where Amandra shows up, is where Amandra tries to take Amu aside and bring her with him as this, like, replacement. And it's such an uncomfortable sequence. It's so like gross in this like appropriate way for the show, where it's not like overtly intimating this kind of like sexual, you know, sort of abduction basically that Amandra's doing, but any, you know, educated viewer is going to see that and see what the power dynamics are there, and this much older man like basically trying to usher this very young woman into his private abode basically, and like what the implications are that, and what he wants to do with her, and this sense of that Amandra's getting ready to take on this whole new generation of young women to replace Full Flat and to replace Mion. And that's where Full Flat becomes completely outraged and moves openly against him. And that's the point in the show where she becomes no longer a truly kind of antagonist figure, but like this anti-hero figure, that she is the one working most effectively against Amandra's schemes, where Daba doesn't know and is not part of that world yet. And that is the agenda she's trying to advance. And the fact that it's all built on the back of this sympathy she has for Amu, that she sees in Amu herself and Mion from 60 years ago in this exact same position, but now she's not as ignorant as she was then and understands the dynamics of what's occurring, and that she has the ability to try to interfere there. The ways in which Full Flat's kind of allegiances and how she operates as this kind of rogue agent and anti-hero in the last 15 or so episodes of the show just makes her such a cool character and such a dynamic piece of the show that is pretty unique amongst Tomino heroine kind of figures. You know, like there are shades of some of these kind of like Haman Karn elements to her, but she's not quite like any of those characters. She occupies a pretty unique position and just makes her so rich and so interesting to watch.
Well, it's this interesting thing where the rebellion's plan is locked in place pretty early before the end of the show with Operation Stardust, which is a pretty good plan, and it works pretty much flawlessly. Like they have some challenges along the way, but like on a militaristic level, they have a lot of that in the bag. And so a lot of what the end of the show becomes is this kind of battle for the heart and soul of these various characters. Full Flat is kind of patient zero for that, because you talked about her powerfulness, right, earlier, but part of that, even before Amandra shows up, is there's this interesting dichotomy within her of being the most powerful character we've met so far, who can dominate anybody, literally or figuratively. But then also she is very set in this almost defeatist attitude about, no, I've got my corner of the kingdom, and the deal is good, and you kids need to stop fighting Posaydal, and she's kind of defeatist about how all of this has gone down. But then she kind of gradually rouses more and more. Basically, the more that like Daba and Amu and everybody are fighting around her and trying to change things, she kind of wakes back up. And then she becomes the person trying to wake up Mion, the Posaydal figure, to try to rouse her into action. Full Flat winds up dying doing that. She gets the same death that Musy Poe's dad had in Dunbine, where a mech falls on her. In this case, the L-Gaim Mark II. I don't think any of our heroes ever even know that Full Flat is dead. Daba does not know he killed her in that scene, which is very dark. But anyway, she's dead. But her spirit lives on, both literally and figuratively, because of all the biorelation stuff within Mion. And of course, the ultimate victor of the show is, like, Daba has to do a lot of stuff, but it's Mion going to that altar less she helps her up there, and Mion basically relinquishes this eternal life, which takes it from her, but also takes it from Amandra, allows Daba and Gable to defeat him and end the war, and all of this stuff. So you have this like set of dominoes of these people from this older original sin generation, basically characters who are effectively demigods within this world, right? They're like the Edenic figures from the garden who have come down, and like they were the first ones, anointed by God. And they basically have to make these decisions to leave choices to the next generation, which is basically to allow for free will in general. And I think Full Flat is the key figure there, because she is this person who starts out as this incredible contradiction of a lot of power and a lot of powerlessness. And she has to decide what to do with that power, which is ultimately about ceding it, which, boy, in America circa 2026, that's an interesting arc to be thinking about, huh?
Yes.
Wonder what that's like.
Yeah, but
someone who's been in power for 60 years deciding to cede it. Man, what a fan. This show is a fantasy, Sean.
Yeah, it is, but yeah, it's just fascinating to see that journey that Full Flat goes on, because I like the way you described that she's so powerful, and yet she also is completely defeated for so much of the show until she is finally roused into action. But her whole relationship with Amu, and that sense of Amu, we talked about earlier, looking at her like this kind of mentor, but that there's something about Full Flat that even if she is ultimately fighting for good now, she is so part of this very corrupted world, and she kind of can't fully leave that, she can't, like, she's part of that whole generation. And you have this a little bit in a great arc featuring another character that I love, that it's not like a super prominent character but works super well, who's Samuj, who is our one of our main rebel figures, who kind of becomes almost like the, not a full-on Captain Bright figure, but that sort of thing where he is this other captain and this kind of reliable second-in-command sort of guy, voiced by the great Genda Tesho, who is, of course, the original Slugger Law from Gundam. He is Toguro, the main, most iconic bad guy from Yu Yu Hakusho, and Kurama, the fox demon from Naruto, as well as, like, a million other things. But I love Samuj's whole arc where you learn that he was a plant and a spy for Full Flat. And you have this great moment where Daba learns about that. He kind of comes back to Samuj in a rage, calms down a little bit, and ultimately gives Samuj this choice. And Samuj chooses, and has really chosen a while ago, that he wants to be a part of this rebellion, that he's not working for anybody else, that he truly believes in what Daba's trying to do, and that the world can be made into a better place and to work towards a better future. And they ask him why he followed Full Flat and why he was a spy for her. And he just gives this great line that is like, I smelled on her the whiff of corruption, and I guess that's what attracted me to her. And yes, it's like such an amazing, like the way that Genda Tesho says it with such weight. And, I don't know how old he actually was at that point, because he's like the kind of actor who has always played old guys for like his whole career, because he plays old people now. But like, I don't know if he was actually all that old at that point, but you feel the weight of the age of the character and the way he says this, and the way that, there's this this generation gap between him and Daba, where you feel like Samuj is someone who has lived this whole life, who has seen the full range of the corruption in this world, and had given up on having a better future. We can have this, like, we can have a better world, we can fight for something better. I don't have to be someone like Full Flat, who is sitting away in the Thart Star, drowning on women and booze and all the pleasures of life. There can be a better world that we can fight for. And it's a great little arc that ties so deeply into what goes on with Full Flat, where she eventually also is roused by Amu into action in the final arc.
I mean, again, so much of it is about people who have been in the status quo power structure for so long that they cease being able to see a way out of it, which describes a lot of our real-world politics to a T, makes this show very resonant. And I think Samuj is a great little microcosm of this, because also in that scene, where I agree, I wrote that exact line you wrote down, or you just noted, Sean, down in my notes, the smell of corruption. But he also says, like, if you'll let me, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something like, if you'll let me, I will devote whatever years I have left to helping you. And it is Semouge moving to this selflessness of saying, whatever my life was, what it will be now is about creating a world effectively without me in it, in me in the ego sense of like, I'm not the center of this world anymore. You kids are. We need to create a new world. And that's what this show very much becomes about, that's why the ending, it's so low key. It threw me at first watching it, but it feels so right, is this sense of, casting off the shackles of the old world, letting something new be born. What will that be? We don't know. The story's over here. But fighting for that moment of being able to build something new on the ruins of the old is everything. It's everything that they are fighting for. And I love how much of this is this tug of war within the hearts of these characters who come from, in one way or another, the old world, having to be roused into that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is appropriately enough for a guy who played the demon fox Kurama from Naruto. It's very much, that's like the whole theme of Naruto as well. So he took that experience of this show well into his future career.
Yes, absolutely. We should probably also double back and talk about some of the characters that we've already talked about in part one, but they go in very different directions in this part. The two main ones I think we need to have a conversation about are Leshy and Gavlet Gabale. But let's start with Gauha Leshy, who undergoes a really interesting transformation here because she leaves. She has a desertion arc, but it is not the kind of desertion arc that we saw several times in Xabungle or even earlier in this show. It is an honest to God, she leaves, and then she has a new role in things. She just completely shifts up her role in the status quo and comes back with a brand new haircut, much more sort of angular, harsh features. She looks like a 5-Star Stories character when she comes back, which I think is funny. She's like very much Nagano Mamoru, really putting his stamp on this. She becomes the commander of the Whale. That ship becomes like the secondary, actually the full-on flagship, because Daba later on makes the Whale the flagship at the front of the fleet so that the Turner, which is this little tiny craft, can be in the back and all of that stuff. But one of the things I'm most impressed with the Leshy arc is that episode 34 is the one where she comes back. She's got her bold new look, all of that stuff. And that is the one where she doesn't want to talk to Amu or Daba or any of those characters. She's got her new, Nouveau Dessard, which is really cool and all of that stuff. But she's trying to do the thing of I cannot talk to them until I have achieved X, Y, and Z. And one of my favorite things about this show is that they dispense with all of that by the end of that episode. That does not become an arc. That does not become a thing where Leshy is holding back and not engaging with the main cast. You have basically both Amu and Daba get through to her, basically tell her fucking knock that shit off. We're all friends. We're cutting through your loner act by the end of this episode, and it just does not become a whole thing. And instead, you actually get to do more interesting stuff with the character going forward. That episode rocks. It's great on its own terms, but I also just love that it gets through what could be a very tedious version of the story in one episode.
Well, you have that fantastic scene where Daba is trying to talk to Leshy and he can't, and she's rejecting him, and so he goes physically onto the side of the ship and through the physical connection talks to her through the ship. This, even though this is a big space opera and has a Star Wars space fantasy, this is still Tomino, and he is an absolute stickler for if you're going to physically communicate in space, there needs to be a medium through which that happens. So you either have to do it through a radio or something like that, or you have to physically touch, right? We see it, I think the first time he ever did that was in Ideon. Of course, we see it here. It's also a big thing in Zeta Gundam and Double Zeta as well. And I love that of them trying to have this heart-to-heart dramatically, but through the steel skin of this ship. And Daba's also in his spacesuit and all this stuff. That shit's fucking fantastic.
It's the version of someone going up to their friend outside their window going, I know you're not looking at me, but I'm just going to talk and you're going to listen. But instead, it's someone in a mobile suit and someone else in a big battleship in space. Tomino is the best. This shit rocks.
Yeah. Exactly. It's just fantastic. And I do think it just works really well for the show to move Leshy in this very different overall role. That one, I think it sort of prevents the kind of fairly tedious love triangle stuff that the show had just kind of done to death at that point, and just there was nothing else to do with it. I think it also just benefits Leshy's character where it just makes her role in the world make way more sense. Like, one thing that did always kind of bother me about her in the first half of the show was that, narratively speaking, she's meant to be a member of the Extra 13, which is like this elite military organization. But she's never allowed to, like, sort of fully express that. Like, there are some episodes of the first half that kind of do. And you have that great one episode where Daba gives the big speech about how they all need to learn what they can from her, because who knows when she will die, or you will die, or any of us will die. But it still sort of inevitably feels like she is in this, because of the love triangle stuff, she's in this very subservient role. Whereas when she gets to be the captain of her own ship, and she's the pilot of the Nouvelle Desert, and she has her own, kind of unique, badass heavy metal, that she gets to fully feel like she is this kind of independent agent working alongside Daba, which is more, I think, like, respective of the position that she should realistically have and the kinds of skills she should have. And you see her just being very effective at negotiating with enemies. She goes on multiple kind of missions on her own. Like, there's that one episode, this is the one where Nemo-on dies, where she goes in, through her own authority, decides to go infiltrate Sveto to, like, attempt this attack on Posaydal. And she doesn't ultimately succeed in that attack, but she gets this really valuable information by having done so. And I just think there's something that helps the show to kind of elevate her. Even if she has less screen time, she feels like a more important character, because when she's used, she has a much more critical role that she serves in certainly like the action and the kind of like military planning side of the show. But I think it also means that when she has her stuff with Daba and her trying to navigate these feelings of, like, I want to be with this guy, but I also understand that, like, when they are together, they are definitively less effective than when they are apart. I mean, they're working together, but they shouldn't, like, be detached to each other at the hip like they were in the first half of the show. They are too powerful and too effective of people for them to be in that situation. They are both leaders, and they need to both be in leadership positions. And that's just a very different dynamic. And I think it reflects on their relationship in a really interesting way.
It totally does. And, this is just something this show does so well. And I noted this even in the first half of the show, that I really liked it was doing this, is it shows the building of a rebellion. Like, it actually starts with Daba Myroad alone with his one buddy on the planet Combe at the beginning of the show. And by the end, he's got a fucking fleet. And we see the build of all of that, right? Like, not every single step, but we really get to see how we go from point A to B to C to D. Even stuff like having the one-off episode about the Polarta star in the first half of the show, then they become key characters in the second half because they are the energy source for the Operation Stardust, but also the kids on that ship are, like, really loyal to Daba and want to do so. So you have characters like Ajin, who is the main kid that you have on the ship, who's voiced by Tobita Nobuo, who will be Camille Bidon in Zeta Gundam, which is a cool little connection. But you have all of those characters, and so you build and build and build, and part of that is having one of our main friends of Daba goes and becomes the, like, commander of this part of the fleet. And so it's that real sense of build. And it's just something that, like, in this kind of space opera space, I don't know if I've ever seen a story do this part of it this well. Because Star Wars, outside of the show Andor, basically takes the existence of the rebellion as a given. It's not about, like, building or maintaining the rebellion. We're mostly focused on, like, our handful of main characters and stuff, right? You don't have, like, a Star Wars movie about Luke Skywalker going out and getting troops and rallying everybody. You'd never do that in, Rey never has to, like, lead anybody in the sequel trilogy. You never do that. And I really like that they take, and I also think this redounds to Daba as a character, is they take that role of him stepping into, I'm Kamo and Myroad now, we're building a fucking army, and he just changes materially as a character so much in terms of, I think, how he acts, his relationship to being willing to kill people, his relationship to the other people in his life, his relationship to us as audience members, because we get so closed off to his internality. But there's all this other stuff building around him that puts that all in this full context, and it's such a good version of this kind of story because they do that. And again, having Leshy go off and be one of the main captains absolutely achieves that. It also reminds me of a little thing that I've always wanted more of from in Star Trek, is in the last Star Trek original series movie, The Undiscovered Country, you have Sulu has gone off and become a captain of his own ship, and he helps Kirk and company out a couple of times, and I've always thought, that's awesome. I wish that happened earlier so we could have seen more of George Takei as Captain Sulu, and I've always thought, they've made a million fucking dumbass Star Trek prequel shows. How have they never just made the Captain Sulu show? Gone off and done that? That feels like the easiest layup in history. Kind of off topic, but I just did get a little bit of that. I was like, yes, this character we love gets to go flourish as the captain. That's awesome.
Yes, well, it's a lot like how in Romance of the Three Kingdoms, you've got Liu Bei and Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, and they have their oath under the peach blossoms that they will, that they were not born on the same second of the same the same hour and the same day in the same year. They don't go into that level of detail, but they will die on the same day of the same month of the same year, and they're all like this kind of unit of a couple of dudes going out fighting the fucking Yellow Turbans, and then eventually once they gain power and Liu Bei's like becoming a leading political figure in the country, like Zhang Fei and Guan Yu can't just be hanging around with Liu Bei all the time. They're like the main guys. They need to have their own fucking castles with their own heroes and their own units and shit like that, and it's very much here. It's like, we've got a whole structure for an entire army. We need to start distributing the most powerful and effective people around. We can't all just be hanging out buddy on this one ship together.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's just all of those, Romance of the Three Kingdoms style influences that are in Tomino's work at this point. That's one that is used for very good here. Then, okay, I mentioned him earlier. We got to talk about our boy,
yes.
Gablet, who in the first half is our Team Rocket figure. In our second half becomes something different entirely. And I think actually you can trace how good this show is and how stark its evolution is through Gablet. Because I think if you told me this is where the show was going in the macro sense, I would have imagined Gablet was going to have to die somewhere to be taken off the board, because the character he is in the first 26 episodes could not exist in the version of the story Tomino starts telling in the second batch of 26 episodes. But instead, Gablet just completely transforms. He is this guy who is jumping from warlord to warlord, basically looking for something he can do with some degree of like pride, and he finds it, and he actually kind of flourishes, and it's an amazing transformation. And boy, oh boy, the actor Hayami Sho who plays him, what a fucking stellar performance from note one to the end in tracing this character. Obviously, we loved him as Burn Bunnings. We've loved him in many other things, but to be able to play this role that, again, on paper is kind of all over the place by the end, but like make it feel like a continuous character, it's outstanding.
Yeah, I've definitely, it makes me wonder if Tomino knew that, like, he kind of fucked up with what he did with the Black Knight in Burn Bunnings in the home stretch of Dunbine. Is like, I let this guy, or this kid at that point down. I'm sure would have been quite young. It's like, but man, he's so good. This young actor. It's like, I gotta give him like a juicy role, and he gets Gablet, and it's like, man, it's like so much to Jaime Sho's credit. Again, like so early in his career, he pulls this off, of taking this character that's effectively a comedic antagonist, that's your Saturday morning cartoon villain character that they fight basically almost every single episode in the first half. Sometimes it's with Ne Mohan, but it's almost every episode of that first half of the show, he is out there fighting against Daba. And in the second half, putting him, he still has the comedy, like that's still part of the character. He's still like a funny character often, but he's in such a more dramatic position as this. I mean, if you're making the Romance of the Three Kingdoms comparison, he's sort of this almost Lu Bu-esque figure, nowhere near as like powerful as Lu Bu, but this guy who is only loyal to himself, and there is something that like that is both his greatest weakness and it's his greatest strength, and that he just like truly he like aligns with every faction at some point across this whole show multiple times. And then sometimes he's aligned with one faction but has to work with a different faction in order to be aligned with the original faction, like when he's sworn his allegiance to Alabi, but Giwaza has kidnapped Alabi, and so he's fighting for Giwaza, but really he wants Alabi, but then he's ultimately helping Daba because Daba's trying to help Alabi, and it's like he's this fascinating rogue agent who I think Full Flat in one of the episodes just gives like this great little comment. It's like, oh, is this the side you're on today? She says something like that to him, which is amazing. But there's something that, because you so see his perspective and understand the kind of guy he is, that yes, he wants power and he wants authority and he wants autonomy, but he doesn't want it at the expense of everything else in the world. He's not power mad like someone like Giwaza. And when he finds somebody that is kind of, I think he sees a real purity in her with Allaby. And he's like, she's so different than all the other people he's tried to serve under, right? He's not going to try to serve under Daba because he sees that he's not a rebel. And also he has a whole complicated relationship with Daba by the time Daba is in a position of authority. But like all the other people, Chai Char, Ne Mohan, fucking Giwaza, Rockley, Posaydal herself, these are not inspiring leaders that you want to give your life to, right? They are all clearly power mad, power hungry people that are out for themselves and are only, and that loyalty is a one-sided affair for those kinds of people. You can be loyal to Giwaza. Giwaza will never be loyal to you. I don't care. You can be the love of his life like Ne Mohan and he will throw you to the fucking dogs if he thinks he needs to. And so when he meets this woman, Allaby, who is worthy of that kind of loyalty, who, even in her brainwashed state, there is like a purity to her in the sense of like, she will do right by the people who do right by her. And he kind of sees that and he's goes for it. And I love that arc for him, that he finally finds the master that he kind of needs to serve. And the tragedy is it's that one that will never fully be, that relationship will never be fully reciprocated for him, but he accepts that and goes with it so gracefully. And it's just such a cool evolution for this character that's very, I think, honest to the character that we always knew and that was there. And it's just, he was a guy who needed to find the right person to help set him straight. And it took him a very, very long time to get there. But I just love that whole dynamic and his being this crazy rogue faction in the massive interdancing allegiances and conflicts between these 4+ factions, the Rebels, the Royal Guard, Giwaza, Full Flat, Abandra. He's like a sixth guy out here, just like, I'm trying to make my way in the world. I got my ship. I got a couple ladies on my ship who are pretty cool. One of them, Pamela, gets fucking murdered, which is very sad. But it's like, and I've got my Hashimosha, and I'm out here doing my shit, man.
Well, I actually wanted to pause on that because I actually think it's very important that Pamela dies. Like, there are not... L-Gaim is not a Kill 'Em All Tomino show. A lot of the villains die, obviously, but there's not a lot of, like, big hero death moments. And obviously Pamela is not, like, a, the top of the credits hero in this story, but she's been there for a very long time because Goblet gets the Slender Scala pretty early. And it is this interesting dynamic early on that Goblet is put on this ship full of women, and he isn't quite sure how to do this. And this is where I also just think, if we're doing a full auteur theory and we're psychoanalyzing Yoshiyuki Tomino, Goblet is so clearly the character he identifies most with in this show. It is so true. Clearly his self-insert of the guy who is surrounded by women, as Tomino is with his family, and he's kind of manic, because Tomino is kind of manic, and he's never really hurting the women on his ship, but they all kind of think he's a buffoon, and he's trying to find a way to not be a buffoon, and he ultimately finds it by being subservient towards the coolest woman. But then also you have that moment, it's in episode 50, which I noted earlier is one that is a big episode for Amu and for Goblet, and I think who big character revelations for them. And part of that is Pamela dying and it becoming real to him. Yeah. And that is an ultimate test moment for him and how much he has or hasn't changed as a character. And the fact that it becomes real. And from that point on, he's actually really good about helping the people who need help. He's pretty much on Daba's side, not in like a formalized, like, I'm here for you forever, bro way, but he is often helping Daba. He is often like very serious about making sure the people on the Slender Scala are okay and all of that. And I think it's also really notable that at the end of the show, when Giwaza and Daba's forces are fighting, you have the Slender Scala in low orbit over the planet, Gustgal. And Goblet is not on the ship, and he's not there to send the order. But the Slender Scala, I forget the name of the main woman on that ship.
Iraine.
Irain, yeah, but she's been watching all of this long enough. She obviously has a pretty low opinion of Goblet in a lot of ways, but she's seen this go far enough that I think she knows what he would want and what would be best for the Slender Scala as he has led it is to just join the fucking attack. Because he had told them, go off and be on your own. Don't die for me. But she realizes, like, she's inspired enough by his kind of idiotic actions to go, you know what? Let's use the planet cannon or whatever they have. And because they're in low orbit, they're able to do this massive firing that just decimates Giwaza's fleet, and that is also kind of indirectly because of Gablet's transformation. The way it kind of echoes out through the world is interesting. So, like, again, it's part of what makes him so compelling as a character is I really, really do think that is the Tomino self-insert character of Heavy Metal L-Gaim, and I think it's a very passionate characterization by the end of this show.
Yeah, it's just a great character. I love him to death. And it's one of the things in the second half that I think the kind of transformation of the style of the show really benefits him, that he is able to be moved off the board for a while and then come back later, you know? Because I think it would not have worked to continue to have him show up every single episode. And because when he goes away for chunks of the show, you start to miss him. And you're like, where's Gablet? Like, where's my boy? I need him back. I need to see what is he up to? What crazy hijinks is this guy going to get up to? And those big hero moments he has in the last few episodes where he and Daba get to team up, you know, and then ultimately in the last episode, he goes to go help Daba and kind of help save the day, are just like really great moments because we have seen these two characters be rivals for so long that there's it's like Goku and Vegeta fighting fucking Boo in Dragon Ball Z. It's just like, yes, like we're here where, the two rivals get to team up against the bad guy at the end of the day.
There's a little thing they do in the dialogue where you have Daba go back to start calling him Goblet-kun.
Yes.
Which he didn't for a long time because Goblet was fucking his shit up, and so it's often Goblet man. It's like, you damn fucking Goblet. But now he goes back to Kun, and he has this kind of softer attitude towards him. And yeah, I obviously, like, there's a certain like 80s sports movie awesomeness to them standing up against the big original L-Gaim at the end of the show, and that's awesome. But yeah, it's a good arc. That last moment for Goblet is also an interesting mirror of Daba's last moment, where there's this kind of bitterness, sadness. It's hard to read, but again, I think feels mixed in its emotions in the way that entire ending is supposed to feel mixed in its emotions. So absolutely, just a home run of a character. And another way I also think you see Tomino coming back to, I said earlier that I think you see Tomino working through some of what he's going to do with Char when he comes back to Gundam in Daba. He gives a little bit of that in Goblet too, because Goblet's arc in the end of the show is somewhat similar to how he wrote Char in the novels of Gundam, where after Amuro's death in the book version, Char kind of steps into the protagonist role and helps the main characters and all of this stuff, and is never where Char goes in original Gundam, but obviously is where the kind of role he's going to take on in Zeta Gundam. And so it's just these kinds of archetypes you can see him playing with here.
Yes, and of course you get the ultimate moment where you get to have the classic framing of the split screen at the end, where when they're defeating Posaydal and it's Daba's head, like, face on one half and it's Gablet's on the other, and they meet in the middle where there's a split in the middle of the frame. It's like just all time,
yes.
I mean, I'm sure this is by far not the first anime to do that. But it's just the most classic shot when you've got your two opposing characters teaming up to deliver the final blow. You got to do it. It's a classic for a reason.
Of all the Tomino stuff I've seen, it is the most shonen anime moment he's ever done.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes.
And it's wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. I think next let's hit one of the other returning characters that I know that we both wanted to desperately talk about the episode that most promptly features her here, which is Lilith Fao, the little fairy who could, who is another character who starts off as a fairly comic relief character and ends up being a very dramatic character in episode 45, I believe, Lilith's Memory, where we have our big nuclear weapon moment. This is like a big Tomino theme that will continue to come up in later things like Victory Gundam. Turn A Gundam has the huge episode in the middle where they discover the nuclear bombs and stuff. This is very reminiscent of that, where it's discovered that on the Plarta star there are two nuclear reactors that they thought were diffused or disengaged, and during this attack they are re-engaged, and so Kao and Lilith have to go try to disarm them. And this is where we learn what happened with the Millery, which was not a thing I thought that the show was ever going to explain, but that they were all killed in a massive nuclear holocaust, and you get like this crazy flashback scene of all of these fairies on this picturesque world, and then a fucking nuke goes off, and it's like, Jesus Christ, the backstory for this adorable little fairy character is way darker than I thought. You know, it's just they were kind of exterminated off screen by the Posaydal army, like what happened to the Yarmon. But there's a poignancy to the, no, it was a nuclear holocaust that wiped them all out, and Lilith is the only one left behind. And then you get this crazy moment that is where it turns into Dunbine for a moment, where the spirits of Lilith's ancestors like possess her, and her soul leaves her body and goes and shoots little lasers that deactivate the nuclear bomb. And then Lilith is in a coma for like the next 5 or so episodes. She's totally out of action. And it is this just crazy turn that is super dark, very powerful. And it also is an episode I happened to watch on the day when the President of the United States of America tweeted out that a civilization was going to be ended that night. This was the day where he tweeted that like he was going to fucking eliminate Iran, was the implication. Didn't mention nuclear weapons, but that's obviously the thing that everybody would read into that. So far, Iran is still here, and there's...
Sean, we are recording this on Sunday, April 12th. I want to be really clear. I don't know what has happened in the world when this comes out a month and a half from now, Sean.
Who
the fuck knows? Believe it or not, J.D. Vance did not solve Middle East peace this weekend. No.
But this was the kind of thing that was in the back of my head, and I did like seriously tear up at the end of that episode where they it's a like just absolutely devastating use of an instrumental version of Stardust Shower, and then they play the second verse of Stardust Shower, and then you get into the ending, which is the original first verse of Stardust Shower. Like, they're really like, you know, laying it on super heavy, but it feels appropriately so. And it's this phase where the show is starting to get deeper into this idea of like that the history of Pentagonal World has shaped the world that they live in, and that most of the characters we know, these kids, are fairly ignorant of that history. Daba knows parts of it with the Yarman, though he clearly doesn't know all of it. He clearly doesn't really know what happened in the Second Saint War, where seemingly we later learned that the Yarmans killed Oldna Posaydal's people. And that there is this cycle of violence and retaliation that has been going on that our characters are relatively ignorant of. And we kind of learn that Lilith is this kind of living fossil in a way, this artifact of a bygone era, a species that no longer exists, a living testament to the horrifying devastation that these kinds of weapons, this kind of technology can lead to, and that like it's the dark path that all this can go down if we are not careful. And the fact that it all rests on the little fairy character that's a weird holdover from the other show that actually was supposed to have fairies in it. Like the justification for why there's only one fairy in this world was a lot heavier than I was expecting, but it's very powerful.
This entire episode is outstanding. The thing I wound up thinking about, because I just rewatched Twin Peaks: The Return, is the scene when Lilith's like ancestors get out and start reviving her. It's like the light inverse of the scene in Twin Peaks Part 8 when Evil Coop gets shot, and then all of the woodsmen come out and start like palpating his body to revive him. And I put up that on Blue Sky, one next to the other, and it made me laugh. But like, there's that image, just all, and as you noted, the end of this episode, that you go from the piano version of Starlight Shower, and then you get the insert song version of Starlight Shower, and the last line of the episode is Lilith in her like coma says, "Let me dream of my friends for a little while longer." And it's hard not to tear up at the end of this one. It's incredible. It's, as you say, such a good, like at the beginning, Lilith is so clearly a holdover from Dunbine, from a crew who just wasn't ready to let go of having a fun fairy companion. And by the end, you can't imagine the show without her, because she's suddenly this incredible part of the thematic tapestry. I also have to give you, Sean, my headcanon that I now have, because the Millery, when they come out in their spectral forms around Lilith, they look like stuff from Dunbine. They also look like the end of Space Runaway Ideon, with all of the spirits going. So here's my headcanon. The Milari in Pentagonal system are the new race created by the Ide at the end of Ideon. That's where all our characters go. They were then nuked, and this is what happens. And so I think Heavy Metal L-Gaim is a far distant future Space Runaway Ideon sequel. There you go.
There you go. Are we on the 5th civilization at this point? Whatever
I'm not sure.
We're on.
Well, we're in a totally different part of space, too, because, all the life in our solar system was destroyed by the Ide, and it became the Milari, and then centuries later they were destroyed in a nuke. But, Cosmo Yuki is one of those spirits in the mix, I think. I don't actually believe this, I want to be clear. I'm making fun of this kind of headcanon, but it's fun to think about.
Yeah, but Lilith, just an incredible character. And then there's also just great moments. I assume you want to talk about her little mech that she makes.
This is the meanest thing Tomino has ever done. This is meaner than any character death. This is meaner than any sad moment. The worst thing he has ever done to the audience is in one episode, Lilith pulls up, she has made full plans for her own mech, her own heavy metal, that would be proportional to her. So instead of being 50 meters tall, it would be 2 meters tall. She would have a heavy metal about the size of you and me, Sean, about 6 feet tall. And she would go around in that. And how do you not do that? How do you not do that? Tomino, we have gone from an Ideon. You put the little squirrel guy in a spacesuit, and that was amazing. Then you had Chamfao, and she got her own little suit, and that was great. Then in L-Gaim, Lilith is actually in space, so she has to have her own little version of those big boxy suits that everybody's in, and that's extra cute. You don't go all the way and give her a heavy metal. What the fuck is wrong with you, you fucking madman? This is more upsetting than the child getting decapitated in Ideon to me, is that Lilith she has her little mobile suit and they don't give it to her. What the fuck?
God, I'm just trying to imagine how surreal it would feel in the show to have this robot walking around piloted by the little fairy character. It's man, the whole ending of the show would have been very different.
She could be the one who kills Giwaza. You have that moment at the end where you have the L-Gaim. I love this little note that they have Daba get back in the L-Gaim Mark I for the very end. It's kind of like the Mobile Suit equivalent of bringing back the original theme song at the end of a show, right? He gets back in and he's got the Buster Cannon and he's ready to fire. And then Giwaza leaves in his little escape pod. And he's like, oh no, we've got to recalculate. What if instead it's we can't do it. And then you have Lilith fly out and go, I've got it, Daba! And she's got a mini Buster Cannon that blows up that one little pod and ends the war. That would be perfect.
Yeah, the only problem with that is that you couldn't do a thing that I was waiting for this whole show. This is from Super Robot Wars Y. Where in Super Robot Wars Y, when you use Daba's ultimate attack in the L-Gaim Mark II, which is just him firing the fucking Buster Launcher, but it's particularly big. But the animation plays where you see into the cockpit and Lilith does finger guns at the camera and goes, Ute! And then you fire the shot. And I was like, please tell me that's actually the thing that happens in the show. And it is. It's just, you got to go all the way to the last episode because that's what she does when he's aiming at Giwaza, is she does finger guns like she's fucking good. Yusuke going to use the spirit gun in fucking Yu Yu Hakusho. He just goes, Ute! And he fires and it's fucking great. And I was like, yes, thank God that's not a thing that they just made up because I desperately wanted to actually see that happen because I love that in the game.
But what if she did it in a 6-foot tall heavy metal? Come on. Yeah. Why? Okay. Sunrise. If Tomino isn't going to come out of retirement for this, I need fairy mech. Maybe that is an anime that someone's made at one point, but I need little fairies in mechs, and the mechs are also little. This sounds so good.
But they have to be in a world where there are also regular-sized people that are the same size as the mechs. That's critical. And that those regular-sized people need to have mechs that are giant from our perspective. And then maybe there should be giant people who are the same size as our mechs, and they've also got mechs, and they're fucking Godzilla-sized. We could just keep going.
That's what Unicron is it's fucking a really big guy and an even bigger suit. Yes, this all sounds good. Absolutely. Speaking of Giwaza, do you want to talk about Giwaza Lowao, our real piece of shit? That's the thing. When you get into these Three Kingdoms style Tomino shows, you've got all kinds of villains, and Giwaza isn't ever the dictator figure that, but he is the piece of shit villain of the show. And all of them have one of these, and Giwaza is a real good piece of shit villain.
Well, I mean, Giwaza is he's the most Romance of the Three Kingdoms part of the show because he is so Sao coded. It's fucking crazy. Like, particularly the second half as we go deeper into him. So we've got Giwaza here. He was in the first half a little bit, but not a particularly prominent character. It's really the second half is where he comes into his own. Voiced by Nishimura Tomochichi, who he voiced Garba in Xabungle, because Xabungle has really good names. He is going to voice Jamatov Hyman in Zeta Gundam. He's Mardukas in Full Metal Panic, which is a character I particularly like. He's the second command of the submarine. He's this really harsh military dude with glasses and this cool hat, and I really like that guy. He's the Tsuchikage Onoki, so one of the Hokage type figures in Naruto. I don't know who this is, but I like this. He's a guy named T-Bone in One Piece, and I assume that that's a cool character. And he's also
actually Sean. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, well, at first, he's Tomoko's grandfather in Tomoko Market, which is not the biggest role in that show, but a very nice one.
A very good role. T-Bone, this is the rare case where I had to look up a One Piece character because I had no idea who T-Bone was. He's one of the vice admirals who shows up a couple of times. He does have a cool character design. It's worth looking up. But he is such a minor character in One Piece that he dies off-screen in between one of the recent arcs, and his death is reported in a newspaper in the corner of a panel in a recent arc of One Piece. So, fairly minor character.
I'm looking at him now. This guy got killed off fucking screen. This dude, T-Bone. Look at this guy. He's got a fucking Charlemagne helmet and a big sword. Come on. He's got a belt that's ropes, but it's got a padlock on it.
I think his big thing is he's in Water 7. They fight him on the train. He's in that area, so he's more a pre-time skip character. But yeah.
Well, I need to figure out why he has a padlock on his rope belt. But I need that. I'll start watching One Piece, but just to learn the secrets of T-Bone, because he seems like a cool dude.
You heard it here first, folks. Season 7 of Japanimation Station One Piece: The Secrets of T-Bone. The Japanimation Station investigation.
Maybe that'll be the next One Piece movie they make, and we learn that T-Bone is T-Bone is the guy who actually made the One Piece in the ancient history of the world of One Piece.
And the One Piece itself is a T-Bone, and Luffy will be very happy with that because he loves his meat. Yeah,
there you go. But anyways, Nishimura Tomochichi, very good as Giwaza, as that kind of villain that you don't think he's going to be as big a piece of shit and as big a deal as he ends up being, but he just slowly accumulates that power, right? And that way that I like his arc of where he at first glance doesn't seem that bad. He's clearly power hungry, but he doesn't seem like that much big of a deal compared to all the other extra 13 members we meet. But slowly he goes deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. And it's the huge turning point for this character to me is when Ne Mohan comes back. And he just decides immediately to discard her. This is when I say he's Sao coded. That's the most Sao thing ever. Sao in the Romance Three Kingdoms is a guy who a dude, he has to flee because people are pursuing him to try to end his life, and he ends up hiding out in the house of this kind of random person who he sort of half knows. And I forget the whole detail of what the whole thing was, but he overhears this guy talking, makes this assumption that he's going to sell Sao away, when really the guy is just preparing a feast to take care of Sao, but he thinks that he's preparing a feast. I want to say it's to celebrate the people who are coming to take Sao away. And so Sao just murders this guy and his whole family to sleep and runs off. Sao is a very paranoid character whose quest for power, he is not afraid to throw away basically anyone or anything for it. And there's something that Giwaza ends up very much in that position and thinks he's the top dog, the top shit, that he's the one who deserves to rule over everything. And anyone who doesn't agree or anyone who isn't swearing obvious fealty to him is someone to be discarded. Or someone to, at the very least, to be immediately suspicious of. And I love his kind of that slow transformation as he goes deeper and deeper. His whole politicking and maneuvering around Full Flat and him trying to kind of assemble these forces against Posaydal while now not outright rebelling against her. While he's never a major focal point, I just think the way that Tomino depicts this character as this political factor in this world, slowly assembling power and turning the Posaydal faction into these two separate factions that Daba needs to figure out what to deal with, because taking care of one is not going to take care of the other. And seeing that transformation, I thought, was a very satisfying element of the second half of the show.
Oh, super satisfying. He also has some of the best, like, fits. I love his costumes.
Yes.
And on his ship, he has that meeting room that is, I guess, a hologram, but it's just space. And so when he, like, his meeting with Full Flat is in this too, where they're standing in outer space is what the meeting room looks like. And there's so many good scenes in that. I know it's animation, so it's not a set, but what you would think of as like a set, that area. I don't know. There's just a lot of good dramatic framing and staging with this character in the second half of the series as he becomes more and more of a threat.
Yes. And then there's that one episode. It's the one where he kidnaps Albie. It's episode 46, Croissant Wave, where I want to say it's probably supposed to be that same meeting room, but it's like turned into a hologram forest, and he has these maids dressed like fucking Disney's Alice from Alice in Wonderland.
Yes.
That they then throw like hula hoops or some shit, or like jumping ropes, and wrap up Albie. It's one of the weirdest things in the show. That it's like, you know, it works fine because it's just supposed to be this trap that he lures Albie in and captures her. But the framing of it is very weird, where he turns it into this like fairy tale picnic meeting room with these maids. And it's like Giwaza, I think, has a very warped idea of what young women are into. And he's like, she's like 19 or 18 years old. Surely she will be into this fairy tale picnic world and let all of her guard down if I do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Who else do we have to talk about that we haven't who's like a new character? Is there any? Oh, well, you know what? We've got Lily. Yes, I had forgotten about Lily.
Yes, we'll get Lily, then we can get to the character you're going to talk about. But Lily Hashi, who is voiced by Mukaido no Asami, who voiced the illusory Toran Milan from Combat Mecha Xabungle and the Combat Mecha Xabungle movie. She's the character from the episode that didn't air in Kansai or whatever the fuck it was.
Yes.
She has not had a lot of different roles, but she's one of those. It's like a very quintessentially Tomino show performance that this actress gives as Lily, who I do love this character. She's just this absolutely brutal woman who just wants to fight and kill people, and she doesn't give a fuck. And there's that whole early arc in the section that we're covering today where she teams up with one of the other members of the Extra 13, Wasan Lune, who is one of like this old guy who's this kind of more conservative military figure, and she's this radical, like, no, let's just kill them all. Like, fuck, like, why are we waiting? Let's just murder every single person that opposes us. And I just love Lily's attitude. She's got a sick mobile suit or heavy metal in the Garoon with a big fucking spear that electrocutes people, and she's just a mean motherfucker. And then she has a great death where Amu just blasts her into fucking pieces, and it's very satisfying. Like, I think she's just, like, great. You know, not like a top level character in the show, but for your kind of brutal, kind of captain level figure on the enemy side, she's a very satisfying enemy, I think.
Oh, no, totally. And her death is a major moment, I think, because you just don't expect to see Amu murder someone that brutally, yes. I guess, because you have like the full, like her whole like cockpit melts around her, that whole kind of thing. It's like a very, no, this character is fucking dead. But no, it's one of the things this show does that I think helps it a lot in the second half is it does diversify the villains quite a bit in having a lot more, because in the first half it's mostly they're just fighting Gable and sometimes Nemo Han. You have a lot more of various military leaders and sub-bosses and all of those kind of characters out to be enemies in this half.
Yes. But what was the character that you were going to mention, Jonathan?
Well, I actually was going to mention we haven't talked about Amandra yet, and the fact that there's an entire recast involved here, which is like very stark. It's like a very obvious recast, so I thought this would be worth mentioning.
Yes, because here I also have to mention that I accidentally ended up miscrediting the character last time, partially because this character is miscredited in a lot of other sources, because the casting is a little bit confusing, because there are at least 4 people, if you include one video game, that have voiced this character. There are 3 main people. So I credited last time Horebe Ryuichi as the voice of Manager Commander, but he is actually the voice in the second half of L-Gaim, not the first. In the first half of L-Gaim, what we talked about last time, that performance was by an actor named Toyota Shinji. He played the character up through episode 33. Toyota is mainly a stage actor. He only has a tiny handful of other voice roles he played. But around episode 33, he fell ill. And so the role was recast purely because he just couldn't appear because he was sick. And so they recast him with the actor Horebe Ryoichi, who plays him in the second half of the role. The character will be recast yet again for the OVAs, where he will be played by an actor named Jinai Tatsuyuki. But the recasting stuff is kind of a little bit confusing because Toyota was originally cast to play Amandra, and we mentioned this last time, and I obviously kind of knew, so I tried to say it without saying it, but that the voice doesn't totally match the physical appearance of the character, but that's very much on purpose. That he was cast to foreshadow the fact that Amandra is a much younger man than he appears, and he is wearing a disguise, because it turns out if a guy looks like he's wearing a disguise, maybe he's wearing a disguise, that he doesn't actually have a giant crazy beard and needs to wear sunglasses all the time. Maybe he's doing that to, hide what he's supposed to look like. And so they cast the character and directed him to play the character to sound younger than he's supposed to appear. But it's kind of weird because when they recast it with Horebe Ryuichi, he's clearly directed to make the character sound very old and gruff. But by the time that Horebe Ryuichi is playing the character, that's in the scene where he meets with Full Flat. It's the first time we get this performance. And at that point, you are starting to fully begin to reveal that this is a guy who is not what he appears to be. He's much older / younger physically than he seems, because he knows Full Flat, who we know is a character who is like 80 years old or something. But so it's like a little bit weird. And then he, of course, does adjust his performance to sound younger in the last episode when Amandra fully reveals himself as being Oldna Posaydal. And I think that Horebe Ryuichi does a fine job. I think the first episode he's in, the performance is like a little rough. I think after that point, he's fine. But it is a shame that we lost the performance by Toyota Shinji, and that, there's nobody's at fault that things happen. The guy got sick. It's not like it was a mistake that someone made to recast him or something. But I just thought that performance of the first half was so good. And that level of menace, like you just could feel the sense of that this is a guy who is tied way deeper into shit than he lets on. And the sense of him being a mastermind, I think that voice really conveyed. And I would love to have seen what Toyota Shinji would have done with the much more kind of aggressive characterization that Amandra has in the second half, where he starts to become threatened, and so he becomes much more violent. But I just remember watching that episode where Amandra is trying to basically seduce and lure Amu onto the ship, and thinking like, man, how much better would this scene have been if we had the old voice of the character, where I think you would have felt the real threat behind that voice, the way the character used to be played. And it's just kind of a shame, that I think the new voice, fine, but like the old voice was fantastic. And it just kind of sucks that we lost that we don't get to see what that version of the character and what the version of that performance would have been.
I completely agree, and it is stark when it comes up and that recast happens, because it's such a different take. I think it makes the full reveal of the character less smooth and interesting than it could have been. Again, no one's fault, but it is a bummer, because I think the Toyota Shinji version, he's doing more what I would think honestly, what it reminds me of, what I think you would have gotten, is something like Furuya Toru in Gundam 00, where he plays, what's the villain's character name he plays in Gundam 00?
Oh, geez. I can't remember off the top of my head.
But it's Amuro from original Gundam plays this villain in Gundam 00, but he does it with this youthful, quiet, soft voice, and it's such a dynamic villain performance, and I think you could have had something like that, because I really loved that about Amandra in the early going of this show, and Toyota Shinji is so good, but... yeah, that's too bad that he fell ill there. But I do think in the final couple of episodes, I think Horebe Ryuichi is better. When he is able to play the fully kind of fleshed out version of the character, you get more there. So that still works. But yeah, worth it to untangle, because that is one of the most obvious recasts I've ever heard.
Yes.
Where you just hear you go immediately there's no am I hearing this wrong? There is oh no, that is definitely a different actor.
Yeah. It just I think it's kind of weird that they didn't try to like direct him to have a similar kind of approach. It feels like I wonder if they kind of second guessed the whole like the dissonance between the physical appearance of the character and the voice, because I can definitely understand that, like, if you're someone just like watching the show from the beginning and you have no sense of that, like there's going to be a bigger twist there, or like for me, I obviously knew there was, that maybe you'd find it like weird that the character sounds so different from his appearance. But I just feel like they do let on that there's so much more about this guy, and that it's such an intentional thing early on that I wonder if they kind of second guessed themselves when they had were faced with the fact that they had to recast, if they were like, well, then maybe let's try doing something that's a little bit more conventional, but it ends up being less interesting.
Yeah. But, there are some other... Horimi Ryuichi also plays Wasan Loon, who is a villain in the early part of this stretch of episodes we talked about. I really like a lot of the stuff around that character. You have, we didn't mention yet, Ginga Banjo playing Murph McTomin, which is gonna be in contention for our list of best Tomino names, because holy fuck, Murph McTomin. Wow.
Yeah.
And Murph is a big-ass weirdo, but he is at the heart of, I think, one of the best animated scenes in the show, and that's, I mentioned that earlier, is the one where he is going to die, and then Heckler steps in for him, and you have Daba just carve these motherfuckers up, and it's brutal. But yeah, I mean, lots of good voices around the side. I mean, one character I think we should come back to and talk about, Sean, is Daba himself. Yes. Because he becomes a kind of, in some ways, colder, harsher character. He has to play things closer to the vest. He's someone who, at the beginning you have a lot of moments of Daba, like, telling people, get out of this mobile suit before I blow it the fuck up. And it feels a little like Xabungle, where this show is very careful in the early going not to show people dying. But in the grand scope of the show, it is not because there's a no deaths, dictate. It is because you have Daba not wanting to do that. And by the end, he's very comfortable killing a lot of people. Floods an entire system at the end of this and kills all these soldiers. And it's an interesting... Well, and obviously the most obvious one being he does a preview of Char's counterattack, basically, with the entire Operation Stardust thing. And so... there's a lot of things that you start becoming, I think, a little bit uneasy with Daba with, even as he is also, like, very heroic. You understand why people would want to fight for him. He is very noble in some ways. But it also means that I think the fact that the finale continues to leave his internality up to the eye of the beholder, and the end of the show isn't Daba reflecting on what has happened to him, but Leshy and Amu reflecting on what has happened to him, is quite the choice. And I think the way this show moves Daba further and further afield from us is one of the bolder things it does.
Yeah, I think he continues to just be a very fascinating protagonist. In that sense of, I think you really feel that when he makes the choice to adopt that mantle of Common Myroad, it's a lot like Char in Char's counterattack, that he's like, this is it. Like, whatever happens, he can't go back anymore. And he's basically, I think you feel this commitment that he's giving his life to this rebellion and defeating Posaydal, come one way or the other. That either he will die in the attempt, or if he survives, he is spiritually dead, because he cannot... if he's going to commit to this rebellion, he's going to have to cross a lot of lines that he was not comfortable crossing, right? This is a guy that the first episode, we see him, kind of wandering around, with aimlessly, and then he kind of adopts this weird quest to go find the owner of this card, that a bandit who he didn't really kill, but who fatally wounded in a fight through, like, kind of basically a, series of events that was Daba's feels some responsibility for, even though he really didn't do it. This guy does lose his life, and he decides to take on this dying request. And that's a level of, like, a sense of compassion and responsibility from someone, and a desire to respect the lives of other people to a really, like, extreme extent, to almost like an unhealthy extent. Like, it's not a thing I think that people generally should do, to take, like, the dying request of someone who tried to murder you and got themselves killed through a series of events that you're not really responsible for. Like, you don't need to fucking go on this crazy mad quest that this guy asked you to do. Like, I get why you'd want to do it, but, maybe don't. And Daba goes from that kind of person to being someone who's quite brutal in some of the home stretches of the show. I mean, you have a couple of moments where he's gonna just blast a motherfucker like full flat, and someone jumps in the way like Amu to keep him from doing it. That happens in episode 50 where he's going to just kill Full Flat straight out, and Amu stops him. And then probably like the most extreme moment of this is in either 51 or 52, where Full Flat has her last kind of heart-to-heart with Mion, fully starts getting through to her. And then this is where Daba has infiltrated Sveto through going through under the underwater passage, and the L-Gaim Mark II's hand comes up, rips the whole fucking house off, and they're just sitting there in the ruins of this room that used to exist there.
It's even better than that. He puts the rifle down and rips through the house with it.
Right. Well, yeah, I think he rips part of it, and then he does that.
Yeah.
And then he's got the Buster Launcher, which is a thing that's used to sink, like, battleships, and he's just pointing it directly at Mion / Oldna Posaydal, and then Full Flat gets in the way, and he hesitates briefly, but I feel like the way that scene is directed indicates that he is absolutely going to kill both of them, and then McTomin interrupts them. The L-Gaim Mark II collapses, and he ends up crushing Full Flat, not probably even realizing that has happened. But that sequence of events where he is there as this domineering figure in this massive machine, pointing a, like, battleship cannon down at two women who are unarmed, powerless against him, and who we just saw this whole big scene humanizing them, showing to us, the audience, that they're not really responsible for most of what has happened here. Literally for Mion, she has had no free will for most of the past 80 years. She has been literally psychically dominated by this figure, by Amandra Kamandra, and has not been able to express her own free will over what has happened. And that she is no more responsible for any of this shit than Allaby is for the kinds of things that she has been doing. And Daba is not going to stop or care or listen to any of that. He needs to kill specifically Oldna Posaydal, and if Full Flat dies in the process, well, she's kind of been an enemy for some of this as well. And there is a sense of, like, he is willing to commit, pretty brutal thing in order to get this rebellion over the line. And I do think it's interesting how far the show is willing to go with Daba to show that he's going to sacrifice some of his personal morality in order to achieve this greater aim. And that's what leads, I think, appropriately to the conclusion of the show, where I think he's a bit broken by having done all of that. And that's where he can't risk himself becoming the thing he was fighting against. He's already in the same kind of position that Posaydal was at the end of the Second Saint War. He's someone who's, been on this quest of kind of personal vengeance. He's someone who's done a lot of dark things. He's someone who has incredible influence over the lives of other people, and particularly these people who really love and care about him, like Amu and Leshy. And if he lets himself, he could very easily step down that same path that Posaydal ended up on. And so instead, he just walks away from all of it. And there's a brutalness and a darkness to that he doesn't see it in himself to help build a better future, because my read on is that he thinks he would taint whatever future that he was going to build at this point.
Totally. It's kind of we mentioned some similarities in structure to Daitarn last time. It is also the Daitarn ending.
It's very much like Haran Banjo and Daitarn, I think.
Now, I don't think that last scene in L-Gaim is as well staged as the last scene in Daitarn, but it is the same kind of idea. And I don't know if it could be as well staged, because Daitarn gets to have this, like, intense focus that this show is sort of too big in scope to have. But it's that basic, it's the Haran Banjo ending. But, like, and then there is the Operation Stardust of it all. That, like, he is doing the Char's counterattack. That if you are someone like you or me, Sean, who has watched Char's counterattack a dozen fucking times, it's eerie how close the imagery is. Like, it is the rockets attached to asteroids that are being sent down, and you've got mobile suits, like, hiding on the back of them, and there's those images they do of the entire surface of Gustgal basically on fire. He is destroying this planet. And I think one of the most interesting things that happens is in the penultimate episode, you learn about Giwaza's plan to drop his big battleship, the Meta, onto Sveto, and he says, I got the idea from these guys. That wasn't something he was thinking of. He said, look, the rebels already started this with Operation Stardust. The planet is not going to be inhabitable. I'll rule 4 planets instead of 5. That's fine with me. And it's it's a train of logic that Daba kicked off. And the thing is, it is a good strategy. It works. The Operation Stardust thing is a rousing success for Daba Myroad, but it is definitely the kind of thing that once you've done that, if you don't want to be that kind of leader anymore, you kind of just can't be a leader anymore. And so that is how the show sort of has to end there. But it is... Again, it is really fascinating to see all of this Char's counterattack imagery several years earlier on this TV show in a fairly different tonal space. It's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it's just kind of fascinating what, like, it's not the arc I expected Daba to have. Partially because this is not, Super Robot Wars Y as a game is going to, the narrative is going to kind of like make everything nicer than the original shows. The shows are darker. So for instance, all the characters from Dunbine don't die at the end of Super Robot Wars Y. They're still around because that would kind of be awful, especially because you couldn't use any of those characters in the game anymore. But Daba has a much more uplifting ending where he does kind of take on a sort of leadership role just alongside other characters. And from what I understand, that is kind of what happens in the novel as well. And so the anime has a kind of like uniquely dark and kind of melancholy ending for this character, but it feels very honest and very earned to me that this is, it's the thing that the show was building up to since it made its big turn and he adopts this persona. And it feels like, like you've been saying, that we are kind of put at odds from Daba, that he's at a distance from us. We don't have access to what he's thinking. And he was already a relatively mysterious character as far as protagonists typically go. That he was more, I think, aloof to the audience than typically this character would be. But he's pushed way further than that. But I just think you can see in the kind of choices he's making and the way he goes about himself as a leader, that when he makes that choice to become Kamen Myroad, he is just fully committed and that he knows that this is the path that's going to lead down. And I think he's basically made the choice of how this is going to end way back in like episode 30, basically.
Of all the Tomino shows I've seen, he is by far the most different of all his protagonists.
Yes, absolutely.
And we've had ones that are a little more outside of the norm, like Jiron, I think, to some degree. But yeah, I mean, Daba is just in a completely different space. It's because he is not just the commander of a ship, he's a commander of the entire army, because of how distant he becomes from us, all of that. And then I also did want to talk about the last bit of writing in the show. This is the very end of the last episode, is when Daba is leaving, and you've got Leshy and Amu on the tarmac, and Leshy says, "With this, Amandra completed his revenge against the Yarman. Daba will spend the rest of his life caring for the doll-like Olabi, and when they age and die, the two of them will be." She trails off. And then Amu, with the very last line of the show, is, "But this is what Daba chose." And then she trails off. And then we get our final, I think it's a really big, like, orchestral, like, send-off piece, which is really good, as Daba's ship flies away, and we get a final shot of the Pentagonal system, and that's it. But it's a very interesting, like, final couple of lines where it reflects on this kind of mutual revenge, and it's a bummer.
Yeah, and it's very different than most of Tomino's endings, which are typically he ends his shows on really big punches, particularly like up to this point. You've got like the end of Zambot 3 is a big fucking punch. Ideon is a little bit complicated because you have the two different endings, but both of them are big crazy punches, I mean, in some ways the TV show is even more so, where it's just like, and that's when the Ide was invoked, and now everyone's fucking dead. But you of course have like Gundam, where you think that Amuro's dead and he flies out. And I have a place to go home to. Can there be anything happier than this? And it's just such a big, rousing, poignant moment. Not a sad one in that regard. And then, of course, from this point, he's going to have like Zeta Gundam with Camille losing his mind, Char's counterattack, with Lala was a woman who would have been like a mother to me. What? And then they die. But like, I think the Victory Gundam, that ending's just fucking crazy. The thing that this ending reminds me the most of in many ways is Double Zeta. Because that's the ending where Judo, where really like the big punch is less the final scene, and it's more his big battle with Haman Karn, and then it ends with Judo making the choice to go off to Jupiter with Ruluka, and have to kind of leave this stuff behind. There, it's a more uplifting ending, but there is still this melancholy sense of like the Earth sphere is a place that these people can't be anymore, that they need to go somewhere else. There, it's a sense that they're going to try to build a better future on a further frontier. Here it is more the sense that Daba is a person who has spent himself, and like, is he truly all that different than Allaby in those final moments? You know, he has more of a sense of his faculties than her, but there's a sense that he is damaged by what Posaydal has done just as much as Allaby is, and that they cannot live in a regular world anymore. And so it is interesting because it feels a little bit different, that it's not trying to end on a big, powerful punch of either a big like line that swells you or a moment that you kind of see, oh, this is what this ending is about. It is this quieter thing, but it's I do think it is very effective.
In general, there's a lot of Double Zeta in this show.
Yes.
I mean, the way it also, because Double Zeta will follow a similar thing where it starts out and you're thinking, this is a happier Tomino show, and then you're like, no, it's not. Double Zeta gets darker than L-Gaim ever does, really, even though it has a slightly lighter ending. You know, L-Gaim doesn't have like a colony drop episode or anything like that. But like, yeah, I think there's that. I think there is some judo, has some, because there is also the whole way that the kids in Double Zeta become the leaders, has a little more of L-Gaim in it than you see in some of Tomino's other works. So, and Gobble is very clearly a prototype for Masha Cello, who is a smaller character in Double Zeta, but has a similar kind of affect and joke. Mashmeyer is more of a joke character, although he definitely has a poignant ending, shall we say. But yes, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up.
All right. Is there any other there's a couple of like ancillary things I want to talk about. We haven't talked about the theme song and stuff like that, but is there any other big story stuff you want to hit, Jonathan?
No, I think we hit it all. There is ancillary stuff I want to talk about too, including the absolutely buck fucking wild episode titles this show has. And I'm going to go through some of my favorites.
All right, so let's hit some of the ancillary stuff. The first thing I want to talk about is we got to hit the theme song, because we haven't talked about that yet. We have a new opening theme, which is Kaze no Reply. Fuck it, a great title, or the wind's No Reply, but it's like a title you can't translate from Japanese because you just miss the whole thing if you don't call it Kaze no Reply, which is composed by Tsutsumi Hyohei, lyrics by Ueno Masayuki, but with the vocals by Ayukawa Bami, who we will know very well as the singer for the first theme for Zeta Gundam. She also did the insert song Kizutsuita Jealousy, which we talked about last time, which plays at the end of episode 24, and that is the only place that song is used at all in the whole show, which is crazy because it's a great song, and it's a great song. It's a terrible use of that song. I mean, it works fine for the scene, but when you know what the song is, you're like, there's so much more potential for this insert song. You didn't even use the hook of the song in it.
Mostly they use Starlight Shower. It gets a couple of plays as an insert song, but that's the only insert song they wind up using in the second half.
Yes, but Kaze no Reply, I like the first opening theme better, but I do think that this is a fucking great theme. It's one I'm already very familiar with because it's on one of the Anna song covers that
Moriguchi
Hideko did. So I've listened to that version a whole lot. Ayakawa Mami obviously has just a gorgeous voice. This song was her debut single, so this was her first like kind of big debut as a singer. And it does have some just like really great pieces, and I particularly love whenever she says "Say Mark II" at the beginning of the chorus, because it's such an anime song line. Because we have the Mark II, and it has some great images. The best one being because a lot of it is like as is often with shows of this kind of vintage, mixing in animation from the original opening animation with some new stuff. But you have that one piece of animation that syncs up with a line that's kind of talking about this, where you have the Buster launcher and this female hand that comes in and sort of like caresses it slowly, as there's a line that kind of describes that same motion. I think it's a very good theme.
It's a very good theme. Its only sin is that it isn't Time for L-Gaim, which is like an all-time great theme. But no, this one, it rocks. I do wish the animation was more different, because most of the animation in it is from the original opening. And it's so, like, that animation is so synced to the original L-Gaim song that I wish they did more to kind of change it up, because it isn't as distinct. And so, because this song, its rhythm is totally different. It's much slower. It's got more of a ballad quality to it. But I do love it. It's a great opening. Definitely, gets you pumped at the beginning of every single episode. And yeah, Ayu Kawamami has a very different voice than Mio. You know, Mio just belts, like when she gets to L-Gaim, and it's like huge. And Ayu Kawamami does not go huge, but she still has a gorgeous voice. And I really like hearing her here, and I'm glad we're going to hear her more when we get to Zeta Gundam.
Yeah, I feel like Ayu Kawamami's vocal style is like, you know, city pop as a that kind of like 80s pop music genre in Japan is starting to become more of a thing at this point, and her vocal styling is much more in that genre, and Kaze no Reply feels a lot like a city pop style song. And it does have, like, I do particularly like the lyrics of Kaze no Reply, because it does have that line near the opening that's something like, you know, I'm paraphrasing off the top of my head, but it's like the world is a golden hourglass and the people are the sand that falls through your fingers. It's something like that. There's a lot of like great, you know, this is not we are now at the point where Tomino is not doing the lyrics of every single song for every single show. He's going to mostly be doing like the ending themes and maybe the insert songs. But I do think the lyrics for Kaze no Reply are particularly good. And it's just like an all-time great title, like the mouthfeel of that phrase, Kaze no Reply. It just is so fun to say. You know, I don't know, I guess I kind of know what it means, but I feel like it's a sort of nonsense phrase that they mostly did because it sounds very good and it feels good to say.
Yes, absolutely. All right, can I talk about some of the titles and stuff?
Yes, because there are some fucking all-time great episode titles for this one.
Well, I wanted to mention this because I was scrolling through my notes and I got to this one section where, so they gradually in the second half, they stop doing the next story, next drama, that whole thing, which I understand because eventually you're out of like new heavy mechs to introduce. Yes. And they are also they also stop mostly doing some of the narrations at the beginning. They're using every second of these episodes at a certain point. But the final time they do the next on thing is episode 43 is next story is, and then it has a picture of Nei and it says Nei's last moment. So they just tell you Nei Mohan is going to die. And then you get the next episode, and episode 44 is called Picaresque Giwaza.
Yes.
Which is Hall of Fame, Mount Rushmore, all-time great anime episode titles. I'm not sure what the fuck it means, but this is the one. It's the one where Giwaza kills Nei, and it is Picaresque Giwaza.
That's because Giwaza, he's a fool. You know, he's a clown.
Yes. Other ones, I started noticing they get better and better as the show goes along. So like episode 41, which is introduced by next story is Turning Point. And that's at the end of when Full Flat has laid Daba's body in her bed. It's like, oh, the next one's going to be the Turning Point. And that episode is called Spy in Spy, which should be the name of a spy movie. Make that the next James Bond movie. Fuck it. Spy X Family should be Spy in Spy. That's just a great title. I want more of those. So there's that one. Episode 43 is called Lady and Girl, which is especially funny to hear Cheiko Otsuka say in the like next episode preview. Lady and Girl is just a fucking great one.
My personal favorite, my favorite is Picaresque Giwaza, but the other best one is episode 47, which is titled Boys, Boys.
Yes. Boys. Fucking great one. Episode 49 is called Lady Killer. I think using a different connotation than our connotation.
Yes.
Episode 50 is Excite Amu. Not Excited Amu. Is Excite Amu. Mwah. Perfect. I'm seeing if I know what. 52 is Final Time. Yeah. I'm pretty sure I know where Tomino's head took an exit on the highway there. I think that's supposed to be finale time, but it's final time because these are all in English. But you've got that. It is not the finale. Episode 53 is just The Dictator. So I love that. And then the final episode actually has a very poetic title that I love, which is Dreamers Again, which is an interesting one. That also sounds like it could be the title of one of Tomino's theme songs for a later one. Like Winners Forever for Victory Gundam or something, Dreamers Again.
Yeah, that one is also fun because, with Cow narrating it, because when the next episode previews, he always ends it with "See you again," and then he says the title of the next episode. And so that one's fun because he says, "See you again, Dreamers again." And you can tell he's kind of having an awkward, how do I say the word again twice, so close to each other?
Here's the best one. Episode 32 ends with a next drama is She's Not Work. And I think it shows an image of Posaydal. It's very confusing. I don't know what "she's not work" means. But then the episode title of 33, and you get to hear Cal say this in the next episode preview and later, is "My Earth." But when said in katakana, it sounds like he's saying "my ass." And I am not mature enough to not laugh at that.
Yes, I mean, it's the classic, if there is like one word in the English language that is basically impossible for someone with a Japanese accent to say, it's Earth.
Yes.
There's so much of that word that's just like those phonemes are not a thing in Japanese. And so, so you do end up, if you're not like trying very hard to say it, you end up saying us is
yes.
Earth. And so, yes, my us is what he says. And it's, it's funny.
Look, we have some deep conversations on this show, and sometimes we talk about my ass.
Yep.
So there you go.
Yep, and sometimes we talk about boys.
All right, we've also got to talk about the heavy metals, Sean.
Hell yes.
Obviously, star of the show, the L-Gaim Mark II. I will still say, I think the L-Gaim Mark I is such a perfect design that it basically can't be improved on, but I do like the Mark II a lot. The Mark II particularly feels to me like a prototype for like the Zeta and especially the double Zeta Gundam, where it is just tricked the fuck out. I really like the use of color. It is so boxy. There are so many lines in its design. I love that the big Buster Rifle has to be plugged in 3 places. It's so cool.
Yeah, the L-Gaim Mark II is great. It's a big boy. He's gonna fuck you up, man. Like, it's the original L-Gaim is very like small and sleek and agile feeling, and the L-Gaim Mark II is like here for business, And yeah, it does definitely feel like it's got like parts of the Zeta and the double Zeta. It's got like the mass of the double Zeta, like it's like big and bulky and intimidating. But I think one thing the show just uses exceptionally well is the fact that it can transform into this kind of jet version, like the Wave Rider for the Zeta Gundam, and the animators just do a fantastic job with that. And I think it just adds a lot of dimensions to the things they can do in the fight. And the L-Gaim Mark II just feels so powerful, and it's a great shift. Even if if I was ranking all the designs, I probably would put the L-Gaim 1 above the Mark II. But in the context of the show, it's the right thing that it moves to this big, intimidating, scary heavy metal. The L-Gaim Mark II is fucking awesome design.
And then there's little things like the L-Gaim Mark I is more of a beige, just slightly off-white, but the Mark II is more gray, not quite silver. It's just these little coloring choices that Nagano is just a pro at. I mean, he's like 21, but still, just doing perfect work here.
Absolutely. Then we've also got things like the Nouvelle Dizard, which is the custom Dizard that Leshy gets in the second half of the show, which is very fucking cool. This is the one that she uses in Super Robot Wars Y. And so the first half of the show, I was like, when the fuck does she get her heavy metal? Because I ended up using her a lot partially because I thought this design was so cool. And I wish it was honestly featured even more in the show because I think it's just such a cool design. And it's got these big like shoulder pads that end on kind of gun points, and it can fire from there. And there's some pretty cool action pieces it can do. It's just got a really great sense of coloring. Like, it reminds me the coloring of the amazing Zaku from Gundam Build Fighters that has a little bit more black in the design to balance out the red compared to the regular Char Zaku. And this has like a similar kind of style to it. It's very fucking cool.
It is. It's excellent. It's got the color of like Char's mobile suit in original Gundam, where it's not red, it's like pink.
Yeah.
It's got a really good coloration. My 2 favorites, and I cannot choose between them, are either the Garoon, which is so good when it is introduced, and then it becomes more of a standard suit, so you see it a lot, and it's got those big fucking horns. It's like an old like samurai helmet kind of thing, like a warlord helmet. It's got the big shoulder like spears on its sides. It looks really cool in motion. And then also the Atoll. I think the Atoll, which also has like one of those like whipped curved sabers, and it also gets MacToman has his own version of it that has these big like shoulder mounted shields. The Atoll gets some of the best animation stuff in the entire series, so those 2 are both like tied for first for me.
Yeah, the Atoll is absolutely phenomenal. When Giwaza when Gablet comes in with that, And he's very enamored with his fancy new mobile or heavy metal when he gets it. Absolutely awesome. It's got shades of the Bachu from the first half in there, which I really love. I also love the Calvary Temple, which introduces all of these as her heavy metal, which is kind of what I know it as from the game. But it ends up being used by a couple of people. But it's got like the crazy crest on the back, and it's big gold and very ostentatious. It's kind of like the Royal Guard heavy metal is very, very cool. A couple of other
I love the gay ROM. You don't see a bunch in it. But that is the one that basically looks like the Gan from Mobile Suit Gundam. Yes. It's got like the helmet that's like comes to a point, and it's got a big spear, but it's purple. That one, I wish it was in the show more. Every time I see it, I'm like, oh, fuck yeah. Please give me a gunpla of that one.
Because this is a full flats heavy metal is what that one is, which is great. You do have this was in the first half, but there's a little scene with that I want to comment on with the Bayaz, which is the one that's like not humanoid. That's the one that the regular fighters from Thartstar use. And you do get a little scene with the guy who's the mechanic that made the Mark II, who mentions, like, he sees one when they're at the Thartstar. He's like, oh my God, look at these things. Now this is where heavy metals need to go. This is the next generation. I mean, there's just no reason to make them humanoid. And I'm like, this is the reincarnation of the guy from original Gundam who goes to Char in the last episode. It is like, I mean, yeah, it doesn't have fucking legs, but it doesn't need them. The legs are just for show. The guys upstairs this joke don't get it. And I love the heavy metal or mobile suit mechanics. They're like, why are we making these things like people, man? Like, we can make it be whatever. It doesn't need to have fucking legs. Come on, like, let's make a weird spheroid fucking dragon thing. I don't know.
And then, of course, the show ends with the original L-Gaim, which is an even bigger, cooler, better colored version of the L-Gaim. It's just awesome. And I watched the finale of L-Gaim, and then I took a little break, and then I watched the 5-star stories. And wouldn't you know it, the big mobile suit in the 5-star stories is also golden. Because Nagano Mamoru is the king of the golden mobile suit. You've got the L-Gaim and the original L-Gaim here. You've got the Gold Knight in 5-star stories, and he designs the Hakushiki for Zeta Gundam. So that is his specialty. And I think we should get him to do an entire Gundam show where he just designs a bunch of, it can be golden Gundam, and all the Gundams are golden, and that would be great.
Well, yeah, and specifically the original L-Gaim is really fascinating because those little glimpses you get of the, like, flashbacks of this past world that just are like Nagano World, where the old character designs of, like, Full Flat and Mion in original Posaydal are so Nagano coded. They're these super androgynous characters, very big and lanky with super long hair. And
more angular?
Yes, much more angular. And you have the sense of, like, I mean, it's called the Second Saint War, the sense of them being like knights and crusaders. And it's really built into the original L-Gaim that is like, looks like if the fucking Knights Templar built a mobile suit or a heavy metal, that's what it would be. It's got a big, like, knight's visor. It's got a red cross on its shoulder, which is the Knights Templar emblem. It's got these two big hilts for its, like, lightsabers on its sides. It's a really, really just fantastic design that communicates the sense that it's from a different era that was this, like, era of romance and chivalry and all these kinds of things that Posaydal has corrupted over the decades.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going off the top of my head, the shows I've seen with the best mobile suit designs, it's Original Gundam, it's Zeta Gundam, and it's Heavy Metal L-Gaim. Like, those are, like, my Hall of Fame, and I could probably think more and add another couple, but, like, my God, just the breadth and depth of amazing mobile suits in this show, or heavy metal, sorry, I'm always going to call them mobile suits. Yeah. If you just like mech shows, I mean, obviously, no one likes mech shows just for the mechs, but it's one of the reasons we come to these shows. If you weren't into the robots at all, it would be hard. I don't know if you'd be totally into these shows, but if you are into the robots at all, Heavy Metal L-Gaim has got to be at the top of your watch list, because my God, these robots rock.
Yeah, the designs are so fantastic, and again, just the animation and how they execute them on screen lives up to the designs, and that's the other part.
Yes.
That you know, I've definitely seen shows before, particularly more modern mecha shows, where I'm like, I like these designs, but when it's like they're using CG and the CG's not great and the direction's not great with it, it just kind of like ends up falling apart a little bit. And here it's like the designs on page are fucking incredible. Like, I want a design book for L-Gaim just to admire them. but then also the way the storyboarding, the direction, and then the animation brings it to life, and the action is so next level. It's just phenomenal. From episode 1 to episode 54, it never drops the ball in that regard.
Oh, totally. There are some shots in this show that, like, reminded me of the Ideon movie in terms of, like, how much is happening on screen. Again, they do some, like, experiments with 3D perspective. And again, this is years before anyone would be using CGI in anime. Sunrise doesn't use any CGI until that one shot of Sweetwater in Char's counterattack. So that's, like, 5 years on from this. But there are some shots where they play with 3D perspective in a way that is kind of mind-blowing to see from an anime from this era, because at this point, if you want to do 3D, you just have to figure out how to draw frame by frame in such a way that it will mimic a 3D camera, and that is conceptually ludicrously hard to do.
Yeah. And it just turns out if you've got a lot of people who've been doing this for a great number of years at this point, who've been in the anime trenches. I mean, even the younger animators that are in their mid to late 20s have done 3 or 4 shows like this. They just have done it at the bottom of the rung, and now they're up at like kind of that animation director role. They've got some chops and I'm sure pretty brutal working conditions in many ways, because they're just making these fucking 50 episodes a year. They're 54 episodes in a year and a little extra. And then immediately you will hop onto the next show, and it's fucking crazy. But I mean, the blood, sweat, and tears ended up with some pretty amazing stuff on screen.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's so cool how we've gone from, we started this season with Zambot 3, where that's Sunrise's first original show that they did in-house. And at the beginning, Sunrise was really just the Tomino unit and then the people doing outsourcing for other studios. And now, by 1984-85, we are firmly in. Sunrise is an institution. They are one of the big players. They've got, multiple units, and they are doing some of the best animation of the decade. And, Tomino's been there through much of that. And it's very cool to see. And obviously, this will pay off in a big way in our next show, Zeta Gundam.
Yes. But before we get to Zeta Gundam, Jonathan, we are going to do, as is our wont, we're going to do a bonus episode for a season, because we always end up doing it. I don't know why we don't just plan it ahead of time, because I guess it's a thing that, like, the spirit must take us. But this episode is our last regular episode of part 1 of our Tomino-Thon, but we will be doing one more, won't we?
Yes, we're going to talk about the Heavy Metal L-Gaim OVAs, which should be fun. We'll see there's some new stuff in the first 2 OVAs, and the third one is all original, and we'll see how those fit in. But we're also going to do, as we used to do on Weekly Suit Gundam, we're going to do some, mid-year rankings. We got to tell you guys, how we would rank these shows. We've got to pick our favorite Tomino names, because we've got to do it. Yeah. And I think we've got to start here so we know what our first batch of Tomino names is before we get into the second half of the season. Maybe we'll talk about some of our favorite mechs, except I think all of them would be from L-Gaim, so maybe we don't need to do that. We'll figure it out, though. We will have a fun final 13th episode before we go on a little bit of a break while we work on part 2 over the summer.
Yes, absolutely. Very excited to get into part 2. Very excited to see these OVAs. So for people who don't know, the first 2 OVAs are basically mostly recut versions of the TV show, with like a little extra short for each of them. But the third one, Full Metal Soldier, is a totally original story that takes place, I believe it's supposed to be sometime after episode 18 of the TV show. If you're trying to find these online, it's actually kind of hard to find the actual compilation versions of episode 1 and 2, because a lot of people just put in the new thing and then Full Metal Soldier. But of course, if you're going to find them to watch, you do have to go sail the high seas, because the fucking regular TV show isn't even out here.
Yes, well, by the time they're listening to this, it is. Yes.
That's a fair point.
Because the Blu-ray is coming out. It will have come out by May 12th, and it does have all 3 OVAs.
Okay,
so if you're getting that set, I've seen the cover art, and it has the OVAs listed on it. So you'll be able to see them there. So one more week of Tomino-Thon Part 1 before we leave you for a little while.
Yes, and I'm very excited to get into all of that, where we will talk about which is better. Is it Boys or Beyond the Todd?
は知りほど美しい時代ない